Good evening and welcome to the December 15th, 2025 meeting of the Menlo Park Planning Commission. I am Chair Andrew Eric, and I thank you for joining us this evening, either remotely or here in council chambers. Established by state law, our city's Planning Commission is composed of 7 volunteer residents of Menlo Park, appointed to 4-year terms by the City Council. Our Planning Commission is not a policy setting body, that's the City Council. We are a policy implementing body. We review development proposals for compliance with our city's general plan and zoning ordinance, which can both be found on the city's website. The Commission also reviews city-initiated land use planning projects, such as general plan updates and zoning ordinance amendments. The Commission reviews development proposals requiring a use permit, architectural control, a variance, minor subdivision, as well as the environmental reviews associated with those projects. When applicable, the Planning Commission reviews below market rate or BMR housing agreements associated with these applications. The Commission is the final decision-making body for these applications unless appealed to the City Council. The Commission also serves as the recommending body to the City Council for major subdivisions, rezoning, conditional development permits, zoning ordinance amendments, general plan amendments, and environmental reviews associated with those projects. If applicable, the Planning Commission reviews and makes recommendations on BMR agreements associated with these projects. Staff in our city's planning division are responsible for processing development applications, as well as for both implementing and amending the general plan, zoning ordinances, and related policies in order to further the goals of the city. Staff is also responsible for the agenda of regular Planning Commission meetings and for prioritizing what and when agenda items or development applications come before the Planning Commission. Planning Commissioners do not have any ability to place items on the agenda for these meetings. We encourage your active participation, whether you are an applicant or interested member of the public, and there will be an opportunity to speak publicly for each specific agenda item, as well as for general public comment. With that, I will call the roll. Commissioner Baruzzi.
Here.
Commissioner Farrick.
Here.
Commissioner Schindler.
Here.
Commissioner Sillen.
Here.
Vice Chair Silverstein.
Present.
I am Chair Eric. I am also present. That makes 6 commissioners in chambers with 1 absent, so we do have a quorum. The next item on our agenda is reports and announcements. Mr. Parada, are there any staff reports or announcements this evening?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Chair Eric and members of the Planning Commission. Let's see. So I think most commissioners are probably aware the council did meet last Tuesday for its annual reorg. Vice Mayor Nash was selected to be mayor for 2026 with Councilmember Wise as the vice mayor. So just wanted to provide that update for the commission. And then also the council will have its last regular meeting of 2025 tomorrow evening. At that meeting, there is a study session that the commission may be interested in. It is a study session to consider and provide direction for public meetings, specifically transportation, location, interpretation, and translation services accessibility. So it's a policy discussion that may or may not have impacts to the Planning Commission. So staff will stay tuned and update or address accordingly the Planning Commission. But that study session is tomorrow evening, so I just wanted to highlight that for the commissioners. Tomorrow night's council meeting is at the Bellhaven Community Campus, so BHCC, just FYI. And that concludes my reports and announcements, but happy to answer any general questions.
Thank you, Mr. Parada. Commissioner Baruzzi.
Yes, Mr. Parada, I'm wondering if you could let us know when the responses for the RFP are due. I was thinking that was pretty soon.
Yeah, no, great question. And yeah, my apologies for not highlighting that as well. Those were due today at 5 p.m. So I don't have any updates, but we'll certainly, if we did get responses to the RFP for the downtown housing development on the downtown parking lots, we will certainly post those as soon as possible this week for the community.
Do any other commissioners have reports or questions about those reports or announcements of their own? Okay, then we will move to item D, the public comment portion of our agenda. Under public comment, the public may address the commission on any subject not listed on tonight's agenda. Each speaker may address the commission once under public comment for a limit of 3 minutes. You are not required to provide your name, district, or city of residence, but it is helpful. The commission cannot act on items not listed on the agenda, and therefore, the commission cannot respond to non-agenda issues brought up under public comment other than to provide general information. Please know that if you are here tonight to comment on one of our agenda items, you will have a chance to speak when we get to that item in the agenda. To learn how to participate in public comment tonight, I'm going to turn to our clerk for this evening, Mr. Ball, to explain how you can participate, and then to please begin our public comment period.
Good evening, Chair, Planning Commissioners, and members of the public. During the public comment period, members of the public will have an opportunity to share their comments or questions remotely by clicking on the hand icon on your screen. Staff will introduce you and activate your microphone. For those calling into tonight's meeting, please click *9 on your keypad to notify staff you have a comment. If multiple people are speaking from the same account, please let us know at the beginning of your time, and we will make sure each person gets a chance to speak. For those participating in person, please fill out a speaker card located in the back of the room and hand it to me. See, we don't have any public commenters at the moment, but we can wait a little while if you'd like.
Okay, I think we'll go forward, and if anyone raises their hand then in the next minute or so, feel free to interrupt me. The next item on our agenda is the consent calendar. Tonight, there is, one item on the consent calendar, which is approval of minutes from the November 17th Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Ball, could you please provide instructions regarding public comment on this agenda item and open the comment period for the consent calendar?
If you're joining remotely, please click the hand icon, or if you're calling in, please press *9 on your keypad. Staff will call on speakers and unmute you. For those here in person, please fill out a speaker card at the back of the room and hand it to me. We have no public commenters, but we can wait a moment if you'd like.
Assuming there are still no requests to speak, I'm comfortable closing the comment period for the consent agenda. And I am actually going to pull this item from the consent calendar. Mr. Prada, do we need to take public comment again?
That's a good question. I think in this instance, no, given that there was just a call for public comment immediately before this specific item, and there's only one consent calendar item. I think we're okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to request a change to the minutes, and then, of course, if any other planning commissioners have requested changes or any other comments on this agenda item, we can take it. My change is, I'm looking at page 4 of the agenda packet, and the paragraph I'm looking at starts responding to the zoning questions. Planner Garcia said staff could research, and then ends with that this project might also complicate the CEQA review in determining the implications of the project. I would like to request a sentence be added as part of the, right after that, as part of that paragraph. It's slightly awkward to talk about myself in the third person, but my request is that the sentence read either exactly or substantially similar to Chair Eric expressed appreciation for the ability to conduct this study session early in the project timeline, which should provide time to staff and the city to address and plan for these types of complexities. Do any other commissioners have requests for edits or comments on this item? Okay, then I'm happy to entertain a motion. can I move? I move to approve item E1.
I'll second.
Thank you. Then I move to approve item E1 with those changes. Okay.
Second.
All right. Calling the roll. Commissioner Baruzzi,
Abstain.
Commissioner Farrick,
Yes.
Commissioner Schindler,
Yes.
Commissioner Sillen,
Yes.
Vice Chair Silverstein.
Yes.
I am also a yes. That is 5 votes in favor with 1 abstention and 1 absent. So that item passes.
Can I quickly express appreciation for the detailed nature of these minutes?
You may. Okay. That brings us to the public hearing portion of our agenda. We are going to move to item F1. Item F1 is a study session regarding the accessory dwelling unit ordinance update. At this study session, the Planning Commission will receive an overview and provide feedback on proposed amendments to accessory dwelling unit regulations in Chapter 16.79 of the zoning ordinance, Title 16 of the Menlo Park Municipal Code, for consistency with state law and to implement city objective development and design standards. The proposed amendments will require additional review and action by the Planning Commission and the City Council, and those are planned for future scheduled public meetings anticipated in 2026. I believe the planner for this item is Mr. Pruder. So Mr. Pruder, I will turn to you for any staff updates regarding the report.
Thank you and good evening, Chair Eric, Vice Chair Silverstein, other planning commissioners, members of the public, Matt Pruder, Associate Planner. I'll be putting up a PowerPoint shortly, and then I'll go over the presentation. And of course, it is only staff here for this item this evening, no applicant. We ourselves are the applicant team. I'll just be one moment, please. Thank you. All right, thank you for your patience on the matter. I'll begin now. As noted already, I'm Matt Pruder, Associate Planner, and today I'll be providing a brief presentation on a proposed accessory dwelling unit or ADU ordinance update for the city. Tonight's going to involve a study session to gather feedback on an initial draft of the proposed ordinance before any future action will be taken. And again, I'd like to just stress, we'll stress this a few times, these are initial, kind of inputs for your consideration, planning commissioners, as well as members of the public for public comment. This is an opportunity for just some initial feedback. This is the first step. So with that in mind, I'll move on. Sorry. Here's a little background as to why the city is working on an ADU ordinance update at this time. Our ADU ordinance was adopted in 2020, and since then, there have been a number of state laws that have changed, generally in the spirit of enhancing the capabilities of ADU development throughout the state. As such, many of our provisions in the ordinance have become outdated and are mostly in conflict with state law. We've also had a housing element update recently in the year 2023. The city adopted the 2023-2031 housing element, and a few relevant programs have been listed here in the bullets that you see, and they're ordered a little differently by relevance. One program that I'd like to note in particular is program H4F, which requires the city to bring the ADU ordinance into full compliance with state law. There are 2 other notable programs listed here, H2D and H7A, which require ADU amnesty and also the creation of objective residential standards, respectively. Now, the city received a letter in December, specifically December 5th, from the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, regarding a request for a formal update on the city's ADU ordinance and indicating that the city's ADU ordinance may potentially not be consistent with state law. This letter was included as attachment B in the staff report. Staff has already begun work on this project, and I should say had already begun work on the project in preparing the draft ordinance and staff report materials that you're reviewing tonight prior to the receipt of this letter. So it happened kind of incidentally. It was not, a cause and effect situation in our case. And the last point I'd like to make on this slide is that tonight's study session will allow the Planning Commission and members of the public with an opportunity to provide initial feedback on the draft ordinance. This draft ordinance that is under review incorporates state law, but also offers initial potential for local objective standards, which I'll cover in more detail shortly. And so moving on to the next, oops. I saved it. I'm sorry, just one moment. I'll just Okay, we'll put the PowerPoint back up just one moment. Thank you for your patience. Slight error today on my part. So we'll move back to slide 3 where we were. And just one moment. And here we go. And I'm just gonna. There we go. Okay. Okay, moving back to slide 3 here. Sorry about that. Okay. Continuing with the matter of feedback tonight, the input that you provide tonight will be greatly beneficial to the review and processing functionings for the city moving forward regarding ADUs. The compliance that we need with state law through these comprehensive updates in the ADU ordinance would provide a great opportunity for improvement and implementation for members of the community, different stakeholders, applicants, developers, us planning staff, and obviously the decision-making bodies like yourselves in terms of understanding requirements and having a much clearer, more consistent pathway for ADU development and compliance and what the actual expectations are. We're providing a limited set, again, of initial local objective standards that pertain to what we will cover in a moment on what we call non-state mandated ADUs. These are ADUs that I'll cover in a moment in more detail. But the draft ordinance is just a starting point. I'd like to, again, reemphasize the fact that it's focused on bringing the city's ADU ordinance into compliance with state law with a limited set of local objective standards that are proposed for non-state mandated ADUs, which I just mentioned. And this is going to be based on staff, a few different factors. We have, the experiences that staff have had, the experiences that you've had at the meetings recently and over the last few years, and also just the different, public feedback we've received over the years as well. And we will have initial discussion on this and definitely a very lively discussion at that to make sure that we cover this very effectively. And again, we'd like to stress this is initial, and this is an opportunity that the commission, you all can recommend additional changes. You can definitely include additional standards or modifications to allow for increased flexibility for those that the state allows by right, these state mandated ADUs. Staff would evaluate any additional recommendations as part of bringing this ordinance back to your review for, once again, another review and consideration, which would be later for recommendation to City Council. I'll get into the scheduling of next steps in a moment, but next I'd like to go into this detail on the different types of ADUs. So basically, we have, I'd mentioned kind of 2 categories here, the state mandated ADUs and the non-state mandated ADUs. And first with the state mandated ADUs, we have, I'd like to make a quick note of clarification. The lower bullet there under size limits, there's a mention of 1,000 square feet as a maximum internal ADU size limit. And that is not the case. We had just received guidance that that's not the limit. There's not a limit for internal ADUs, no square footage limit specifically. So that can be just kind of stricken from the record at the moment. But going back to the top here, we have these 4 categories of state mandated ADUs, and these are a type of ADU that basically could involve internal, or what we also called interior ADUs, or converted ADUs, where basically the ADU is a conversion of existing existing structures. So it could be an existing accessory building, accessory structure. It could be an existing primary residence. The point is there's existing square footage that's being converted that already exists today. Same applies there with JDUs, which they've been listed together there. There are also single-family detached ADUs in a single-family residentially zoned property where the ADU is being basically separate from the primary residence, not attached but detached. There are also multifamily converted ADUs and multifamily detached ADUs, same kind of idea, but the multifamily zoning. And then this does not include attached ADUs, which I'd like to clarify. These attached ADUs, to be clear, are ADUs that involve the addition of square footage alongside an existing structure. So you have an existing structure, existing square footage. The attached ADU would be additional to that. It wouldn't be converting any of the interior space. So there's an important distinction to be made there. Attached ADUs are rather common, so it's something that is not a part of this. The size limits, getting to the lower points here, we have the detached ADU is set at a simple maximum of 800 square feet, and the JDU is up to 500 square feet. If you go beyond 500 square feet, it's no longer defined as the JDU, but rather it would be an internal ADU, and it would have different provisions and expectations. And again, internal, formerly interior ADU. And then this basically, in this full category, these are all required to undergo only ministerial review. There's no format of discretionary review that is possible for these types of ADUs. So we'll move on to the next slide. And we are now going to talk briefly about a little more detail here. These are some of the requirements that we've already covered in previous kind of reviews, and I think a lot of projects have involved this. The minimum requirement of a 4-foot side and rear setback, which is a state mandated ADU requirement. That's been the case for some time. We're just repeating that point to make it clear. And there's also another provision here for height increases for detached ADUs, and it depends on context. 16 is the standard height maximum that is across the board, but it can go up to 20 feet given specific varying circumstances. Just quickly touching upon that. And then the non-state mandated ADUs, we have a few categories here just to briefly cover. Detached ADUs that are exceeding 800 square feet. So if you have enough square footage on your property to allow for a larger ADU that's detached, there's potential there, but it would be a non-state mandated ADU. And there's also an attached ADU of any size. Again, I mentioned earlier, the attached ADUs are not part of the state mandated ones that we mentioned in the previous slide. And so they also similarly are under a separate set of expectations. And so that's an important point to make.
Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Mr. Purdue, can you put it in speaker presentation mode just to make it a little bit bigger?
Sure, I could do that.
I think if it says from current slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully that helps a little bit. So moving on to the objective standards, I'd like to just quickly highlight some of these local objective standards. And I think the important thing to note here is these are, again, initial. I'm going to be stressing this a few more times. Initial points to consider. The Planning Commission, members of the public can weigh in on, a variety of potential objective standards that we can create. But again, they're not for state mandated ADUs. They're for non-state mandated ADUs. So these would be for ADUs that are not guaranteed by the state by right. And so this, kind of relates to some of the requirements we had once required. Sorry to be redundant there, but we had similar kinds of requirements we've applied before, and they're no longer allowed for all ADUs. And so this is an opportunity for the Planning Commission to think carefully about applying different expectations, different requirements along these lines, Some of this kind of relates to how we've applied requirements to single-family residential housing. So there's kind of this idea of continuity, I think, that's generally expressed. We had drawn these together, but just quickly going through the points, you have internal ADU conversions with greater setbacks and lower wall heights. State law says directly that you are entitled to a conversion for an ADU, but it is very direct on having the same dimensions, which would be the depth, the width, and the height. And so the key here is we are proposing that a potential flexibility could be considered here where you could have perhaps a greater setback than required. So if a building were on a 1 foot setback and they decide to do a 2 foot setback, it's not the exact same wall location. And that could be something we could consider, but that would be something we would be adding as additional flexibility. Same thing with wall heights. Daylight plane and building profile. We had previously had some work in which our earlier ordinance had a form of daylight plane that was required for detached ADUs, for attached ADUs. And the building profile is a similar type of requirement, but that's for R3 zoning and other types of multifamily. We could still have a situation where that could affect a building's step back situation if it was needed. So it's something to consider. Interior access is something that the non-state mandated ADUs could potentially be required by law to not have. You could consider basically prohibiting it for these types of ADUs. Exterior access is not a prohibition, but rather an encouragement to have a dedicated pathway, potentially some kind of path requirement, all-weather surface, something along those lines to ensure that there's a separate pathway for an independent access. And then permitted encroachments is just, a consideration for something like, say, eaves. We don't have any provision in the ADU state law or handbook regarding eave encroachments, for example, and we may want to consider something that allows for that for these non-state mandated ADUs. Quickly moving on. Additionally, there are a few more here, just quickly going through them. These pertain to different instances. I won't go into as much detail here, but other items you can consider regarding some design features, but also the nature of ADUs, the timing, the square footage, and just if we have something we want to be more flexible on, is something that we want to be more specific on. That's part of the consideration there. Moving on, just a few more slides to go. We also have from state law, a separate topic here is processing requirements. And so this is a situation where we now have a new review process. When we have ministerial review for an ADU that is considered by right a state mandated ADU that we have to follow state law directly. There are 3 kinds of phases, if you will, or I should say 2 phases, each with an appeal period. So kind of 4 phases total. There's a completeness review when an application is submitted based on the submittal date. We would have 15 business days, which are based on the days that we're open. So City Hall, as you're aware, has an alternating Friday closure. So there's a bit of a uniqueness when we're applying our business days. We'll need to think about the timing of that because it's important relative to our calendar, which is different than business days for Monday through Friday every week. But that is the first review phase. We have to deem the project complete or incomplete by 15 days. The decision could be appealed by an applicant, just the applicant, at that point. They'd have a 15-day appeal period for that. I put that bullet once because it's also possible in the second instance, after the completeness review, we have the approval denial review, which is kind of just a shorthand explanation for the final review stage where it is determined by 60 calendar days. So it's just 60 days straight, whether or not to approve or deny the project after we've considered it complete. And so after that decision, there's another 15-day appeal period potentially for the applicant to file an appeal. And this would be an important moment because it may be in either appeal situation, if an appeal is filed, that it would go to the Planning Commission. We have initially put that forward in our draft ordinance as the appeal processing for the project. And following that, there's another processing detail that's a little different, but the state law requirements now have established specific requirements for utility connections and fees, sanitary sewer requirements, as well as fire code compliance. So there's a lot more alignment with these other reviewers and providers of these services for ADUs. And almost done. Again, repeating the point here that there's an opportunity for feedback, but again, it's initial feedback. It's initial kind of inputs that we're giving you to work with. There's a lot here that to think about and reflect on. And definitely, we want to stress that this is an initial stage of review, and it's very important that the, input is considered in that context. This is not a final draft. This is not something to be voted on. This is a study session. This is a conversation, and a lot of that feedback will be provided tonight, but it's critical that we get that feedback so we can then work on what is necessary for creating the final version of this ordinance. And we have a few details here. Draft ordinance, like I said, is attachment B. This is a focus on being compliant with state law, as well as getting potentially more flexibility where state law has certain requirements. We could potentially be more allowing of certain things if preferred. And then the other important note here is the local objective standards, again, for non-state mandated ADUs. There's an option there for the Planning Commission to consider providing a variety, like I've noted before in the earlier slides, of different, mostly design, but other types of standards that, you could be added to these non-state mandated ADUs. And following that next steps, the study session is tonight, as noted already. We have an opportunity here for, your evaluation here of what you have to say. We will take that in. We will provide, revisions as needed. We will work on this and prepare updates that are needed for this ordinance. And then we have a separate phase here in the third bullet regarding HCD ADU ordinance review, and that's a 60-day review period required by HCD. The writers of that letter we had talked about a moment ago, they basically will need to review this to determine that there are no compliance issues on their end and to basically give us the okay. And what will happen is either we can provide that earlier or we can provide that after adoption with City Council, but we're still working on deciding on which option to take. But in either case, the next meeting would be another meeting with you, planning commissioners, sometime in the first quarter of 2026, ideally. And then the ideal path forward after that would be the 2 required meetings for City Council, which would be the first reading and the second reading. And those ideally would culminate in an action of adoption, ideally in the second quarter of 2026. And that concludes my presentation. I apologize again for the lengthier presentation this time around, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions. And I believe following that, you can proceed with public comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pruder. First of all, I just want to express appreciation to staff for all the work that has gone into this already, even for this initial draft. So at this point, we're going to move to any clarifying questions from commissioners to staff. I imagine, given a report with this complexity, there might be quite a few clarifying questions. So I just want to assure any members of the public that are here for public comment that we will get to you. And an important part of this meeting is to hear public comment. And I also think probably the clarifying questions from commissioners will help inform both the public and those comments. So with that, do any of my commissioners have clarifying questions for staff? Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Pruder, I was wondering to sort of help structure the question, could you put the slide back up that differentiates between state mandated ADUs and the non-state mandated ADUs? You've preempted most of my questions with your slides, but I think it's helpful just to have that further context now and probably for the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Schindler, would this be the slide you're speaking of?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So I just wanted to confirm what you said is sort of verbally as you went through this slide, as well as the following one. So my first question is just confirming my understanding of attached ADUs. So there are no versions of attached ADUs that are considered state mandated ADUs. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And you gave us a verbal update when you presented this slide. You said that for internal ADUs, whether those are inside the primary residence or inside an additional structure, it's an attached structure, there is no size limit. There's no size maximum. So here it says internal ADUs size limit is 1,000 square feet. You verbally told us that that is no longer, that is not the case.
That was an erroneous point, yes.
Okay.
No limit on the internal ADUs.
Okay, great. So detached ADUs have a cutoff of 800 square feet. And if it is bigger than that, if a detached ADU is bigger than 800 square feet, it is considered non-state mandated ADU.
I think I understand the question. So basically, if there is some addition going on, is that the kind of nuanced question here? If some,
Actually, so I think,
sorry,
well, my question was primarily just if there's a detached ADU and it's bigger than 800 square feet, it's considered not state mandated. It belongs on the other slide.
Through the
That's-
chair, I can answer that also, if it'd be helpful.
happy to
Sure,
defer
go
if
ahead.
you are, City Attorney, sorry.
City Attorney Dougherty.
I can't see Matt, so I can't see who's talking. Yes, the answer to your question is that is correct. So under the category of state mandated ADUs, or more specifically, I like to refer to them as section 66323 ADUs, detached ADUs qualify for that category if they are less than 800 square feet. If they're more than 800 square feet, they may still be permitted, but not under the state mandated criteria, which suspend all local ADU development standards.
Thank you. I think Mr. Pruder was also heard in one of my other statements, my next question. There are confusing uses, in my opinion, of the word attached and interior and conversion, whether we're referring to elements of the staff report or even some of the state language. If there is a conversion, like an attached structure, a garage, an attached garage, I believe would be considered an attached structure.
Could you please clarify, is the garage in question in this scenario, would it be attached to the main residence?
Yes, sorry, I
As-
mean attached to the main residence.
Okay,
Yes.
I think we would see that entirely as one primary residence, and it
Okay.
potentially is conversion of the existing residence, so to speak. Even if it isn't like entirely garage square footage in the garage area, it's attached to the main residence, therefore that's all one residence, one building.
Okay, thank you. And I think the JADU language is consistent with that. It defines attached. Okay. If something is added, like on the second floor is added to a one-story garage, how would we consider that in this framework?
We would see it as an attached ADU. And I think that's irrespective of whether it's a detached garage, the garage is freestanding, its own building as a garage alone, or if the garage is attached to the main residence. In either case, there's an attachment to that building. So we're treating existing structures as, again, more broadly, accessory buildings, accessory structures, primary residences, whatever that building is. If something is being added to that building for the purposes of, if square footage is being added to the building for the purposes of an ADU, that's considered an attached ADU here.
Okay. I think I understand. So any addition is considered an attached ADU, even if the thing that's being expanded is a detached ADU. So let's say there is a building in the back that is being like an expansion of an accessory building. Maybe it's not. Is it an attached, or is it an expansion? Hang on, I gotta get the language right. New or is it a conversion?
That would be a conversion.
Okay, so a detached ADU that gets expanded is a conversion.
Maybe I can just chime in real quick, and I think
Please.
Mr. Pruder can definitely add more, but I think just to maybe help set the stage and clarify a little bit, I think when we say attached ADU or a detached ADU here, I think maybe we can back up. Sounds like we're talking about an existing accessory building that would be converted to an ADU. Is that, okay? That, I'm hearing a lot of different
Yes, I
terminology. and so I
think
just want
so.
to get
That
on the
makes a
same
more
page.
logical
Okay.
use case.
Yeah. Okay. So in that case, it would be, as Mr. Pruder mentioned, an internal conversion. An internal conversion can be a detached or a detached accessory building could be an internal conversion, such as a garage to a ADU,
Okay, thank
whether
you.
it's attached or not.
And just to confirm, so with those two categories, right? So I think we've just identified that any ADU scenario is going to fit into one of those two buckets. So then there are two buckets of laws as I read the staff report. There are the sort of the state mandate, let me pick the exact right language here. The mandatory state regulatory clauses, changes that we're making, and then the local objective standards. So is it correct that, the state regulations apply to both categories of ADU?
I think certain regulatory mechanisms exist in terms of the 4-foot side and rear setback. Like that's a standard for ADUs generally. But there is permit streamlining. That is a big part here. We talk about the 15 business days for review. We talk about there are a few examples here. I don't want to be too elaborate, but there are specific differences with the guaranteed ability for ADUs that are considered state mandated to, in a much more, I'd say focused and efficient manner, be approved and have fewer restrictions. Other ADUs that do not meet that requirement could potentially have much more rigorous requirements imposed upon them. We could require more. We have the ability and the discretion here with the 2 meetings of this commission and the 2 meetings of the city council to determine a variety of additional local requirements for those ADUs that do not fit the definition of the state mandated ADU under section 66323. So in short, this is an opportunity for that input. And I would say that, yes, if you were to potentially by default say, no, we don't want anything for these other types of larger ADUs or ADUs that don't meet the state mandated definition, I think the state doesn't have in its laws so much restriction, additional restriction for these larger sizes, other than there was a mention of, I think, bedroom count as one more specific example, in square footage limitations for that. And so it's really up to the Planning Commission and ultimately City Council to determine if these other ADUs outside of the state mandate should have additional requirements and restrictions, or perhaps fewer restrictions. There could be lessening of some restrictions too.
Okay, thank you. What I took away from your answer is that we have the ability to create our own set of local objective standards that would apply to the state mandated. And my question of, do all of the state regulations apply to both categories of ADUs is not all of them. Some state regulations apply only to state mandated ADUs. Some state regulations may also apply to non-state mandated ADUs. So I think it would just, with that understanding, I'll hold my question and just say it may be helpful as we go through element by element to just clarify, this is state mandated, this is local. It applies to one or the other or both types of ADUs. Does that make sense?
That sounds great. Sure. Thank you.
Commissioner Baruzzi.
Okay, I'm more confused than I was before, but I have a question. So my understanding, and I think I'm probably wrong about this, but I just want to clarify, is that if we see what we frequently see here, which would be a complete reconstruction, right? So we're seeing somebody take down an old house and build a new house. And that house would often, almost always actually lately, include what they would call a junior ADU, which is not detached, right? And the permissible additional square feet that we basically must ministerially approve is, I think, 800. You can add up to 800 square feet beyond what one would normally be able to build. That's what we're seeing. So what I'm a little confused about is, and that usually means that the footprint of the house is larger maybe than it would have otherwise been.
Yes, I think in this scenario, that's true.
Okay.
It's possible.
So what I think I'm hearing is that that falls under the state mandated bucket. But if somebody with a smaller house decided to build an extra 800 square feet attached to it, the same stuff doesn't apply. It would not be ministerially approved because it is considered an attached ADU as opposed to.
I think that's correct what you're saying. And if I could maybe just kind of say that back, you're stating that if someone were to add on an additional 800 square feet to an existing residence, whether that's considered an attached ADU. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I think what I'm hearing is that doesn't fall under the state mandated category.
Maybe I can chime in. So
Okay.
I think all ADUs are ministerial unless they deviate from the city's local zoning ordinance. So there is a provision in our draft ordinance before the commission this evening that does allow for a use permit request to modify a development standard that an ADU proposed does not necessarily comply with. Otherwise, state mandated and non-state mandated ADUs, that's how staff has looked at, but as City Attorney Doherty mentioned, it is a section of state law 66323 for state mandated ADUs. Those are all ministerial, provided they meet the state law and city zoning ordinance. So there's no discretion in either
it.
case. Non-state mandated ADUs, the city is allowed to apply local objective standards to those, provided they don't prohibit the creation of an ADU of the guaranteed allowance, 800 square feet, and a number of other development regulations. So does that kind of help clarify?
Yeah, but let me ask the question a different way. So if we see somebody who's building, I'm trying to remember if junior ADUs at present, the setback standards still apply, right? Because in our current, yeah, they do.
No,
No, they
not.
don't.
Sorry, they do not.
Okay. I think to speak in plain English, what I'm trying to understand is if we have a current system right now that incentivizes people tearing down a building and building an entirely new one, as opposed to adding something. Like if we're somehow penalizing people for adding 800 square feet to an existing building instead of scraping it and starting from scratch. I just want to kind of grasp whether that's the current scenario.
So if I may, I think certainly appreciate the question. We can certainly take that. I do think that's deviating or moving away from clarifying questions. It's really starting to enter into more of a discussion that probably should occur after public comment.
Totally. I just want to
but
understand if my understanding is correct. Like that's, so for example, if I were building a house with a junior ADU attached to it, that meant that I could be closer to my neighbor's fence than I would be if I were just building a house with no ADU. That falls into the ministerial review category, but not the addition.
Again, through the chair, that understanding is not correct. You do not get more square footage or a more lenient ADU because it's proposed with a new primary dwelling unit as opposed to with an existing primary dwelling unit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That helps.
Okay, I do want to follow up there because what the city attorney said is my understanding reading this staff report, but I don't know if this is a clarifying question or not. I'm happy to discuss it later. That seems like a change from our current practice where we see coming to this commission a lot of attached ADUs to new houses that share a wall. And in all of those reports, it says this project contains an ADU that is not a discretionary thing and should be ministerially approved. And I, in my head, had thought of those as attached ADUs because they share a wall with the building. So I guess what I'm asking is this a change to city law in that respect?
Still
Or
can't see
perhaps-
Matt. Still can't see Matt, so can't tell if he's turning it to me or not. But so that is current state law, what you just summarized. And the city, although the city's current ordinance has certain inconsistencies with state law, the city just applies state law on its based on its current ordinance. And so again, that wouldn't be a deviation from current practice because that's what's in state law right now.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to harp on this because I feel like I'm reading something incorrect. I'm looking at the draft ordinance in attachment B, section 16.79.070, units subject to limited standards, which to my understanding lays out which developments the city shall ministerially approve. Within that section, I see internal ADUs and JADUs, and I see detached ADUs. I do not see single-family attached ADUs. And so if we adopted this ordinance and a project came to us with a totally new build, but with an ADU that was attached, my understanding reading this ordinance right now is that that ADU would be a non-section 66323 ADU and not a section 66323 ADU.
So I'll start, but City Attorney Dory, you can certainly chime in and correct me. But in that scenario, that's an internal ADU. It may seem like an attached ADU, but it's not in addition to an existing structure or existing primary dwelling. So in those cases, those are internal ADUs and are state mandate ADUs. And
Okay, but
look-
then the draft ordinance says may include an expansion of not more than 150 square feet beyond the same physical dimensions as the existing accessory building or structure.
Yeah, I appreciate the the question there, and I'll look to Mr. Pruder to clarify further. But just to answer that, it is that if you look at the full sentence, the full clause of the draft ordinance, it is an ADU within a proposed space of an existing single family or existing space of a single family dwelling, accessory building, accessory structure. And so really that may include an expansion that is allowed per state law for ingress and egress associated with an internal ADU conversion or a JADU conversion. And that is for an existing primary dwelling. The two clauses kind of come together there, but that would not apply to a proposed development because if you have a new single family home with an internal ADU, effectively what I think the commission is referring to is things they have seen recently. Those don't have an expansion of 150 square feet because that's not germane,
Okay, but then-
it's not existing yet. Does that make sense?
Sure, but I'm reading this and it seems to be saying that we're going to allow an additional 150 square feet, but all of the internal, or I'm not going to say all, many of the internal ADUs that what you're classifying as the internal ADUs that come before this commission allow an additional 800 square feet.
The 150 feet is required by state law to allow for ingress and egress to an internal conversion ADU. It was that provision was added to the state laws a couple of years ago to accommodate external stairwells and covered pathways that some cities consider to be part of the internal accessory dwelling unit. It's not an attachment for living space.
Okay, I understand that. Commissioner Schindler seems to have an understanding that I don't, so maybe.
May I offer just, I think a question, but I think you might be asking, so tell me if this is correct. Are we trying to get at the question of what happens to allowable square footage?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if this is still a clarifying question, but I will definitely want to know more about the answer to that question as it relates to the parts of the staff report that talk about the ADU square footage and the parts of the report that talk about the guaranteed allowances that talk about essentially floor area coverage.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
I think we can
we-
close this conversation for now and maybe take it for later. But I'm interested in a situation where the building coverage allowance based on the lot size is 3,000 square feet, and applicants come to us and they come with something that's 3,800 square feet, and the guidance to us has up until this point been, we allow that because they're allowed an extra 800 square feet. But I am not seeing in this current ordinance where that 800 square feet is allowed as a state mandated ADU. I'll just leave it there and maybe we can discuss when we come back. Do other commissioners have clarifying questions? Vice Chair Silverstein.
I have three clarifying questions. The first, this is my understanding, and I'm just hoping you can tell me if that's correct. An attached ADU has a minimum 25-foot height limit per state law. Therefore, an ADU above a detached garage, which would be considered an attached ADU, would get that height limit by right.
Yes, that's technically true.
And the follow-up is, however, an ADU that is not above said detached garage would not get that same height limit,
To clarify, I think this-
assuming it's detached in
Sure.
itself.
for example, a detached one-story garage that is being converted would not get the 25-foot height allowance. Is that an example you're thinking of?
Either a converted garage or an entirely independent
Okay.
ADU structure.
Yes, you are correct in both examples. Yes.
Okay. A very quick follow-up question. Does the attachment from the ADU to said garage have to be a vertical attachment such that the ADU is only over the garage, or could it be a horizontal attachment such that it is to the side of the garage but now is 2 stories high because it has the 25-foot height limit?
We'll need to look into that further, but we can definitely follow up on that matter. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll just chime in to reiterate that. So certainly this is a study session. We may not have all the answers. And so certainly questions like this, appreciate it. We may not be prepared to go down a hypothetical discussion that tends to potentially result in incorrect or misstated information just because we're thinking about too many different hypotheticals. So for a lot of these questions, we'll take them, we'll receive that feedback, we'll evaluate, and we'll consider it and determine how to address it and explain how we addressed it, or if it's something that couldn't be addressed, we'll explain why in the ADU ordinance when we bring it back for recommendation to the council. So appreciate it. I just want to kind of set that expectation. A lot of these hypotheticals are probably going to just be taken in this evening, okay?
I totally appreciate that context. Some of these thought processes might influence our discussion when we're trying to figure out which way to go which way to take things, but I totally agree that I don't expect you guys to have all the answers with all the nuances.
Appreciate. Happy to take the hypotheticals.
Yep.
Not asking you to stop that, but just want to let you know kind of our position.
My second question is, for non-state mandated ADUs, are there maximum bounds that should limit our discussion today? For example, square foot limits or any other limits for which we should make sure we're staying within?
No, not necessarily. We're happy to take any of the feedback and definitely evaluate and follow up. And obviously, this can be a conversation. If follow-up questions come up after this meeting, you can definitely let staff know. But yeah, that's our stance on this. It's definitely a working conversation here. Thank you.
Sorry. I just want to take the opportunity because I had a similar question, just looking at, it's page 5 of this report, page 13 of the agenda packet in table 1, which describes ADU changes to development standards per state law. And there are a couple bullets there that say, the text right above that table says, these minimum requirements must be applied to all ADUs. And there's text that says, the maximum size of a one-bedroom ADU shall be no greater than 850 square feet. And then in another place, it says an internal ADU could be no more than 1,000 feet of interior livable space. I might be reading that table wrong, but I think a potential reading is that there is a limit to non-state mandated ADUs. And I just want to clarify that, in fact, there is no limit to non-state mandated ADUs per state law.
Thank you for that input. Definitely noted. I think the main items here of concern, I think this table, and you know, apologies because it is a very, very detailed table. There's a lot going on, a lot of details. But I would say that this is not exactly the same thing as all the requirements for state mandated ADUs, this table alone. I think there are some other items in here that if we go through them in more detail in the discussion, we can clarify further. And obviously, this is a work in progress, but yes, there are some items here where you could potentially allow more flexibility. For example, I think some of those bedroom requirements, that's a limit that's set by the state, but you could, I think in theory, have something more flexible or more permissive, for example. And I think that could be the case with a more straightforward setback, requirement such as side setback. It could be closer than 4 if preferred, for example. It's not something I think that's necessarily preferred, but I think that's where I think in this table, tried to draw the line on certain requirements, but it has a lot more in it, I think, in terms of the overall state mandated requirements versus state mandated ADUs. I think there may be some detail here that could get a little more complicated and more nuanced. And I'm not sure if that's more in the discussion section, but we can definitely go into that further as needed.
Okay. I think your answer to Vice Chair Silverstein's question is what I understand as well. I'll just read. I'm reading from the state ADU handbook under the FAQ section. Can maximum unit sizes exceed 1,200 square feet for ADUs? And the state's answer is state ADU law does not limit the authority of local agencies to adopt less restrictive requirements for the creation of ADUs. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the clarifications. My last question is, it is my understanding that California AB 1033 that passed in 2023 is a bill that gives the cities opportunities to allow homeowners to sell their ADUs as condominiums. Is there a reason why that wasn't included as a part of the study session on our ADU ordinances?
We definitely appreciate the feedback on that. Something we could look into. We could definitely, following this meeting, go into it further. It would potentially have a broader impact on Title 15, the subdivision ordinance as well. So there would be a little more involvement with that title as well as Title 16 here, the zoning ordinance. And so we're happy to take that in. There's no strategic reason for it not being included, but it is something you could consider. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Farrick.
Thank you. Just one quick one. Kind of going back to that earlier note that there is no maximum size for an internal ADU. Is there some that could be taken quite to an extreme? Does it need to be smaller than the main house, or is there any sort of ratio that you use? Or could it just be like an exponentially large unit with a very small main house?
Thank you for your comment. I'd like to defer to our city attorney potentially for some feedback on that, if possible.
So the state laws do not reserve to city discretion the ability to impose a maximum size limit on section 66323 internal conversion ADUs. The practical effect is that yes, you could like divide a single family dwelling into 2 ADUs of the same size, and the ADU could become larger than what was previously considered the primary dwelling living portion of the unit, of the primary dwelling unit. Under the California Building Code, there are limits on the minimum size for primary dwelling units. And so the primary dwelling unit would be limited to being larger than that minimum size.
Do you know what that minimum size is?
I don't. There's efficiency units are 150 square feet. No no dwelling unit in California can be smaller than 150 square feet, but I don't know if there's larger primary dwelling unit, or I don't know what the features are of larger primary dwelling units that aren't considered efficiency units.
And so I understand your answer correctly. For an internal ADU, that term internal ADU then only applies to conversions of existing homes, not new ADUs that are integrated into a new complete development?
It applies to both under the state laws. State laws allow internal conversion ADUs for converting space in an existing or a proposed primary dwelling unit, but the practical effect on sizing is the same. You don't get to expand the size of your primary dwelling unit beyond sizes that are otherwise allowed in Menlo Park's municipal code to accommodate an internal conversion ADU. So you get your primary dwelling unit, and then a portion of that can be converted into your internal conversion ADU. And state laws, like I said, do not reserve to cities the ability to impose a max size on those internal conversion ADUs.
So thank you, but on the new development ADU, not a conversion, a lot like we've been seeing, a proposal, an applicant could propose an unlimited sized ADU
No,
and then, no?
no, because they're limited by the size of the primary dwelling unit for internal conversion ADUs. They can propose a primary dwelling unit plus an attached ADU, or a primary dwelling unit plus a detached ADU. If they propose a primary dwelling unit plus an internal conversion ADU, then they're limited by the size of the primary dwelling unit for the primary dwelling unit, and a portion of that primary dwelling unit becomes the internal ADU.
So they don't get any additional footprint of square footage
Correct.
because it's a internal.
Correct.
Okay. So in the case of the more recent, then those would not be internal conversions, those would be attached.
Internal conversion ADUs never add square footage to your primary dwelling unit, to your lot, I should say.
So what is the correct term for that which we've seen where there's
Attached.
Okay, so it is attached. Okay. I thought you were saying no to that. I misheard you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one other clarifying question. I appreciate, thank you, Mr. Pruder, for noting that this is an initial draft, and I appreciate all the work and the fact that we're not going to have all the answers tonight. I just want to clarify that staff's intent with this is focused on bringing our ordinance into compliance with state law. And by way of this report, staff is not saying this is our draft or certainly final recommendation for what ADU laws should look like in Menlo Park. This is a draft focused on what does it look like to bring our ADU ordinance into compliance with state law. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. Okay, Commissioner Sillen.
Thank you. I had a question about parking. So table 1 under parking, it mentions that we are requiring 1 space per unit unless a parking exception applies. But then below that, it mentions state law restricts the city from applying any parking standards to state mandated ADUs. Is requiring a space per unit not considered a parking standard, or am I misunderstanding? I was just not clear on whether we are allowed to require an additional parking space for an ADU, and if we are, what types of ADUs that would be for.
Thank you for your question, Commissioner Sillen. It's my understanding that the parking requirement is that the state mandated ADUs do not have a specific parking requirement now. Therefore, it's a matter of requiring parking for non-state mandated ADUs, these larger attached ADUs, other types of ADUs. Those are still subject to the requirements. However, there are additional exemption details to factor in. And the one involving the parking permitting, I think, is rather critical for the city to think about, as it is more impactful for this city given our overnight parking restrictions throughout much of the city.
Sorry, can you clarify what that exception is specifically that involves parking permits?
Yes. So to clarify a little further, we have a series of exceptions, exemptions that still exist, and there's one additional exemption that's been added with state law since 2020 that is different from our current existing ordinance. So we have other ones that are still the same requirements. The one that is different here is that in the instance that a parking permit of some kind is required, in this case, perhaps overnight parking permit to park from 2 to 5 a.m. in residentially zoned districts, if that's required and not possible, not something that can be granted, and there may be restrictions, there may be limitations, it may be a capped number that they can provide, that parking could be exempted. That scenario is another exemption that could occur. And it's our understanding that the parking permitting that's required is a little limited for a very large portion of the city and mostly residential areas. So, Bellhaven area, the West Menlo, Allied Arts, all these areas, I believe, have the same 2 to 5 a.m. no parking allowed. Overnight parking is banned for those hours. And so there's an issue there of being able to get that permit. And if it's not possible, that is a possible exemption.
Okay, so if I understand correctly what you're saying, it sounds like in the areas where we have the overnight parking limitation in Menlo Park, but that ADU we couldn't require an ADU, even if it's not a state mandated ADU, to add a parking spot. Am I understanding you correctly?
Could you repeat the question? I apologize. I didn't follow it.
Yeah, it sounds like I would just want to clarify that is what Mr. Pruitt is saying, that in any area where we have the overnight parking limitation and you have to get a permit, and my understanding is that in Menlo Park, you can't, as a resident, you can't get like an annual permit to park overnight unless you're in specific multifamily zones, but for the most part you can't. So if you're in one of the places where you can't get that annual permit, then we would not be able to require the ADU to add parking in any case, whether it's state mandated or not. Is that correct?
I think so, and I think it's an opportunity to clarify. I think that really only applies to ADUs in multifamily zoning districts, since single-family zones are not eligible for overnight parking permits, so that clause doesn't actually apply. So I think to just clarify what Mr. Pruder was saying, we're really talking only about multifamily zoned parcels where that clause could apply, if that makes sense.
The clause that exempts the requirement?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for single-family homes...
Single-family homes are not eligible for overnight parking permits, except for temporary permits, but those aren't at play here. So single-family zoning districts are not eligible for parking permits overnight at all, in terms of like annual parking permits, I should clarify. And so therefore that exemption or exception to when parking is not required per state law doesn't apply to single-family zones in Menlo Park. It could apply to multifamily where certain multifamily districts, and it's a subset, not all, which I don't have off the top of my head, I apologize, that those could have this parking exception, if that helps clarify.
So for a single-family home, if it's a non-state mandated ADU, can we require additional parking to be added?
Yeah, one space, as mentioned in the staff report, that's the state law maximum we can apply, and we can't be more restrictive than state law even for non-state mandated ADUs.
Okay, even though the resident can't get that overnight parking permit, that doesn't matter. Okay.
Correct. And I just want to maybe through the chair take an opportunity. We're at 8:15. This has been a pretty extended clarifying question and comment period. We may have members of the community that are interested in providing public comments. I might recommend is a very passive way of me saying I recommend that we move to public comment first and then pick up clarifying questions, just for the benefit of the community who might be waiting here.
Okay, I see no commissioners absolutely clamoring to make a clarifying question, so let's do it. Mr. Ball, could you please provide instructions regarding public comment? And with thanks to our public, start the comment period for item F1.
If you're joining remotely, please click the hand icon, or if you're calling in, press *9 on the keypad. Staff will then call on speakers and unmute you. For those here in person, please complete a speaker card at the back of the room and hand it to me. It looks like we have one hand raised online and no public comment cards. So I'll go ahead and let Sergio Ramirez speak in just a moment. Okay, you may go ahead, Sergio.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. My name's Sergio Ramirez. I'm the general manager here at West Bay Sanitary District, and I'm calling in today on a from a professional standpoint, although my parents do live in Menlo Park. Um, I really appreciate this study session, but I would like to let the commission know, and I understand this is a study session, that the district recently learned that of over 400 ADUs which have been approved by the city of Menlo Park without the benefit of the district's review for sanitary sewer service and its impact to the community sewer system. So I just wanted to mention that, and we are working with staff on this matter so we can rectify things. My question is, how does this or how can this ordinance address the need to have the ADUs evaluated for sanitary sewer service? That's the question that I'm posing on the table here for staff and the commission. I understand there's a need to kind of move these ADUs and the process along to meet state mandate requirements, but there are local requirements that we evaluate the sewer system to make sure that we are not placing ADUs over sanitary sewer easements that are generally 6 feet from the back of the property line or the side of the property line, when setbacks are only 4 feet. It's a direct conflict of most sanitary sewer easements. That's just one example. The other is when we allow dwellings, especially detached dwellings, to share in the sewer service lateral, basically the service line. And then the ADU is sold as a separate parcel or to a separate owner. That also creates a direct conflict because now you have two separate owners sharing a sewer service. And when there's an issue with that service, it's not very easily dealt with. We found this out in the past, so that can also be a conflict. Also, not being able to collect sewer service charges on an annual basis per dwelling or per ADU. The current sewer service charge annually is $14.40, so $1,440 a year. This service fee allows us to maintain the sewer system, upgrade it, and then also upgrade the local treatment plant and treat the wastewater that's eventually released out into the bay or in some cases recycled. So anyway, so these are all conflicts that we see from our perspective, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comment.
I see no other hands raised or public comment cards, but we can wait a few more moments if you'd like.
Okay, I think we've given it enough time, so I'm going to go ahead and close the public comment period, which brings us back to commission discussion and this study session. I believe Vice Chair Silverstein had an additional clarifying question, so we'll go to that and then to general commission discussion.
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question, which I don't know if it's too important, but I was confused when reading this. It seems like the California mandated ADU requirements have a different threshold for existing multifamily dwellings that allow up to 8 detached ADU and proposed multifamily dwellings that only allow up to 2 detached ADUs. Am I understanding that correctly? And does anyone on staff know why the state would differentiate between existing and proposed multifamily dwellings?
Thank you for your question. We believe that you are correct, but we would need to look more into the reasoning behind that in more detail.
And as a follow-up, it's my understanding that as part of our discussion, we would not be able to limit the number of detached ADUs on an existing multifamily dwelling below 8, and we would not be able to limit the number of ADUs on a proposed below 2, but we would be able to raise either of those numbers if we wanted to.
Maybe could you clarify your question a little further? You're saying that we could allow for a more permissive approach that's allowing additional units if we wanted? Is that kind of a path you're considering asking about?
The state differentiates between existing and proposed multifamily dwellings. If we wanted to say, let's not differentiate between those and allow 8 regardless of its existing or proposed, we would be able to do that.
It could be considered. I think that's something that we could look into, and you could definitely give us this feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Baruzzi.
Yeah, this should be fairly straightforward. What is a direct all-weather pathway?
Yes, thank you for the question. There are a few key components. It's mainly based on Public Works guidance and requirements that they provide. And the main thing with all weather is that it's concrete. It's usually that. I think pavers could also be sufficient, but there would be more of a review of the paver materials in question. But that's generally the idea. And then I think the other part to add, accessibility, the appropriate width, I think 3 feet or 4 feet, I can't recall exactly, but I think we'd also think of that. We didn't get into dimensions, but I think the other idea here is that we start with an all-weather surface that's appropriate for conditions. And then the other item that we considered here was that pathway continue to public right-of-way, or perhaps, you know, it's an initial thought, but it's something that you could consider as planning commissioners if you want something more rigorous in that regard, and if you want a certain sizing of how wide that path should be, and so on.
Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you. Since Commissioner Peruzzi brought it up, and we're on the topic, I will share my one-sentence feedback on that. I would strike the word direct from the description. Direct is not an objective thing. I don't know how you would define that. Like I, for example, think it would be perfectly acceptable for someone to walk from the public right-of-way across the driveway of the primary home to a sidewalk that then eventually goes to the side of the house. So is that direct? I don't know. Like I could think of a bunch of different scenarios, and I happen to think the word direct is completely subjective. So unless you defined it, you should strike it. I think it's easier to define all weather than it is to define direct.
Okay. Commissioner Baruzzi.
So I'll just advance a quick opinion. This won't be the last thing I say tonight, unfortunately for you. But I just want to frame my thinking. I totally support just getting us in compliance with the state and making sure that we check all those boxes. I'm a little uncomfortable doing things beyond that without some additional framing conversations that are sort of beyond the scope of your report. And the reason for that is that we just don't have enough of the big picture. So, for example, questions that were raised for me that I'm not expecting you to answer tonight were, you know, how many of the ADUs that we've permitted in the last few years are occupied? I know how, I've seen how we count them in our reports to HCD, this many very low income, this many low income, this many moderate income. But are any of those actually, I mean, how many of them are actually being rented? And so how is our policy working from, not just from a like checking the box goal, but from a, meeting our housing, making a good faith effort to meet our housing goals goal. And so I'm uncomfortable, for example, making determinations about parking restrictions or about, even internal access doors when I don't understand more about the big picture of the way ADUs are being produced and used and what some of the hindrances are. It feels a little bit premature. I mean, I'm happy to share my initial thoughts, but they're not going to be as well informed.
Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you, Chair. I think Commissioner Abruzzi brings up an important point of just framing and sort of context. I wasn't thinking about it exactly the way that she laid out in terms of looking backward and historical analysis, but I did sort of pause to pull up and say, what would be the criteria for determining whether each of the things that are in the staff report are going in what I would consider the right direction. And so as I read through, I was looking for two main categories of things and a couple of smaller things, but two big ones. One are the regulations that we're talking about here, working toward creating more housing units for the city, meaning units that are independent and desirable, meaning independent, like not part of the same primary house. The second big bucket that I was thinking about was about, frankly, less operational work for the city staff. And for me, that had two components of it. It was less work on a per project basis, making it easier to review and approve a given project. But it also, I was thinking about it with a longer term angle secondarily, meaning that fewer city resources would be required to come back and rework these regulations in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years as state law or trends change. So those are considerations that I had. There are also mentions in the staff report about taking into consideration, right, things that are for the benefit of neighbors, and I think that those are also important criteria that I valued as I read through these two, but they're not the big ones that I started with. And since I'm holding this piece of paper, I also would appreciate more context about how this fits into the other element, the other part of the housing element program, HF4. So the staff report talks about some things that are in that program. And in some cases, it sounds to me like what we're talking about here tonight helps us. It gets us, like, if I'm going to be sort of broad brushstrokes, about halfway through the things that are mentioned in this program. So the description of program H4F talks about being in compliance with the HCD letter, so check. It talks about increased parking flexibility. Yep, check. It talks about streamlined approvals. Yep, got that. It talks, the program description in the housing element talks about the city's role in providing guidance and even marketing, like presumably promoting ADUs. I don't see that in here. And I'm wondering if that where that falls in the timelines we've been talking about, since I think we have 6 months to respond to HCD, if I understood correctly. It does, the staff report, okay, sorry. Another thing that was in the program description in the housing element was about having pre-approved ADU designs. The staff report talks about that. This body of ordinances doesn't address that yet. It sounds like it's a separate work stream. So that's not in here from my understanding. And then the final thing that is mentioned in the description of the program in the housing element is to have potentially collect information about ADU rents, projected ADU rents. I don't see that in any of the mentions of the ordinances, but it also wasn't mentioned in the staff report. So I think when we come back and we talk about this again, I would just love to know not the detailed version, but how each of those components of H4F, where it stands and how much of it is addressed, how much of the work is addressed by, or more importantly, how will HCD see this work as addressing H4F? Do we get half credit, 75% credit? Like, where are we? And if you're taking votes, I think the idea where we show HCD a draft, wait 6 months for their feedback, and then do planning commission and city council seems like a more logical option than completing the ordinance and then giving it to them and taking changes as an amendment, which was discussed in the staff report. So those are kind of my process thoughts. I have more later.
I think I have more later too. I would like to come back to the discussion we were having during clarifying questions, because I am still unclear on how we would treat, if this draft ordinance went into effect, new construction units. Let's take an example, someone's building a new house that is allowed a floor area of 2,500 square feet based on their lot size. My understanding is that if they came to us and built a house that had a 2,500 square foot main residence and an 800 square foot attached ADU, as defined by the city attorney during Commissioner Farrick's question, my understanding is that we would need to ministerially approve the extra 800 feet based on state law. So my question is, A, is that correct? And B, where is that found in the current draft ordinance?
Yes, thank you. That is correct, yes, to answer your first point. Your second point is that we have a section titled Guaranteed Allowance, and that mentions that a guarantee of an 800 square foot ADU must be provided. So each lot is guaranteed that no more than 800 square feet of guaranteed allowance. We're saying guaranteed allowance, and I know I think a lot of jurisdictions have a different way of phrasing this, exceedance, exemption, all these different things, but our term here is to use allowance. And so that gets at the question, one ADU can get the extra 800 square feet. And there are a lot of other criteria based on the type of ADU and the nature of these different ADU categories, but that's the section in question.
Okay, and we are, I don't know if it is a state mandated ADU, but we are treating that guaranteed allowance as as if it is a state mandated ADU. In other words, it needs to be ministerially approved and not subject to a conditional use permit or use permit or anything.
Yes, as I was saying earlier during clarifying questions, whether it's a state mandate ADU under that government code 66323 or non-state mandate ADUs, those are ministerial. So
Okay.
yeah, I think the commission has picked up on the word ministerial, but I think maybe more importantly, everything is permitted in the ordinance as designed currently, the draft, whether it's a state mandate or a non-state mandate ADU. Where the discretion comes in is there is an allowance built into the draft ordinance, which is something that we carried over from the current ordinance that says if you're deviating, if you will, from these standards, you can get a use permit from the Planning Commission. So for an example, let's say detached ADU has a minimum 4-foot required setback. That could be reduced by the Planning Commission to 3. So that's just a kind of an example to help clarify. That's where that use permit conditional use section of the draft ordinance would come into play. Otherwise, I think focusing on permitted versus ministerial, they're all permitted, all ADUs, whether it's a state mandate or non-state mandate ADU.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you. I want to be totally sure that I've understood the guidance that was just given as it relates to the guaranteed allowance. in the table where it describes the guaranteed allowance, it talks about not prohibiting an ADU with at least 800 square feet of floor area. I read that as being bigger than 800 square feet. So I may be reading it incorrectly. It may be phrased incorrectly, or this might mean that the guaranteed allowance only applies to ADUs that are bigger than 800 square feet, meaning you don't get the additional square footage if it's less than 800 and therefore an estate mandated. It was the third of those three options was my assumption. But I would be very curious to get that clarified.
I think there may be a little confusion with how the table is framed, so apologies for that. The idea here is that the guarantee is up to 800 square feet. So if there was something beyond that, it's not a guarantee. So 850,000 square feet, we don't guarantee that per state law. And we're not proposing that in this current draft that is, again, initial feedback, just getting a sense of the commission's views on it. I think there could be a larger number that we could propose if the commission wanted that, for example, but the language is intended to read that up to 800 square feet is guaranteed on every lot for one ADU. And there could be other permutations if more square footage is available and so on, but that is what allows the exceedance to occur on a lot.
Thank you for clarifying. I had founded a number of conclusions based on my incorrect interpretation. And I'm disappointed. I hope that was something that was being changed.
Commissioner Sillen.
Thank you. I also wanted to share my sort of thought criteria similar to Commissioner Schindler. I thought that was helpful, but first I guess I wanted to chime in on this discussion about the guaranteed allowance. So if somebody proposes, we're taking Mr. Pruder's interpretation that we're saying we're guaranteeing up to 800 square feet. So if someone were to propose a home that goes, let's say that it's a 900 square foot ADU, would that require a use permit? And two, in the case of that use permit, would we be only considering the excess square footage and everything else would still be objective standards, or does that open up the entire ADU to, Planning Commission conditional approval?
Okay, thank you for your question, Commissioner Sillen. So one, you would need to have availability for that additional 100 square feet beyond the guaranteed allowance, the way it's currently written. So we could say, for example, if there were extra square footage, if we're just taking floor area, the current site in question, and I know we're dealing with a lot of hypotheticals here, but I think this is it's good to illustrate, I think, in this discussion. So I think it's really helpful. But we have, for example, a lot where there's 100 square feet to spare. So it is possible to have a 900 square foot ADU. If that is the case, then the question then becomes if the other, state standards would apply, and they would, the objective standards would apply. But in that situation, it would not be a discretionary review. We wouldn't need a use permit if the square footage were there. I believe there is an option here with your review of this ordinance to consider if, other square footage allowances could be considered, possibly greater in size, larger size allowances or something along those lines. We have not proposed that in this ordinance, but it is something that is definitely part of this active conversation we're having and could be considered.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think I was more talking about the scenario where there's not that extra 100 square feet, or any other situations where, like Mr. Parado was saying, any other situations where someone might fall under that category where they have to apply for a use permit for an ADU. Does that use permit application limit the discretion of the planning commission just the things that are like outside of our development standards, or is it now the entire ADU and like, you know, the siding choices and what have you?
So it's a good question. Let's see, and I think I might want to take a step back. The floor area limit, let's say, for a single family zoned property, excuse me, that is not subject to the use permit. So that's a cap. That's set by the general plan, set by the zoning. So in that instance, the ADU couldn't exceed that cap, right? So the guaranteed allowance is to go above and beyond the floor area limit that's allowed on a property. So that's state law. It says, hey, cities, you need to allow for and not create a situation where a ADU can't be 800 square feet minimum. And I appreciate the clarification from Commissioner Schindler. We can certainly look at clarifying that text one way or another based on the commission's guidance. But the state is saying you need to allow and permit an 800 square foot ADU regardless of your maximums, right? So that's where that guaranteed allowance comes in. But that is a hard cap. Floor area limit or floor area ratio, depending on the zone, plus the 800 square feet. And it's livable space. It's not necessarily explicit to our floor area limit definition. It's really livable, which our definition is not quite tied to livable. So there's some nuances there. We don't need to necessarily get into that. So I just wanted to clarify that first. And in answering that, I think I forgot your second question. So if you could repeat it, I apologize. I wanted to just clarify the guarantee allowance a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you. Could you maybe then give a couple of examples where someone might need a use permit for an ADU, and in that example, would the whole ADU then become discretionary, or just the part that's required by the use permit?
Yeah, no, appreciate that. That's Matt was reminding me at my left ear, and I was listening to you. So both of you clarify for me. Yes. So the entire ADU would become discretionary if there was a request for a modification to a standard. And so like setbacks are an example I used before. State law and our local ordinance does apply a 4-foot minimum setback for detached or attached ADUs. And so those can be modified, right? There's those setbacks. That's an easy one to think about horizontally on the lot, 4 feet minimum per state. An applicant comes in, they could ask for a reduced setback. In that case, the entire unit would become discretionary. Now, the city, I think, and this is where I'll maybe turn to the city attorney, can only apply objective standards. I don't believe you could necessarily regulate the design and materials of the use permit. You really be looking at the city's objective standards and the request in front of the commission. There may be some nuances there, but you really couldn't apply additional discretion that's not a objective standard, if that makes sense. Not as a super subjective discussion.
Okay. Well, I mean, then for the planning commission, there'd be nothing to discuss, right? Staff would just go through the objective standards and see if they're met or not.
In terms of through a use permit process, or we?
Yeah, like when I was saying discretionary, I meant, things that the planning commission could potentially condition, which I assume wouldn't be an objective standard, correct?
I think it depends. As we mentioned earlier, like hypotheticals are difficult to answer, in the forum here this evening, but yes and no. I think it just depends. And where the commission's discretion would be is that, let's say we're using the example, and like I said, hypotheticals are difficult to talk through because there's always something you're not thinking about in a hypothetical situation. If you're looking at a reduced setback, you're really looking at what are the effects of that reduced setback. And maybe there could be ameliorating factors such as height reductions that could come through that potentially. What I think I heard Commissioner Sillen state was really some objective standards or some standards that weren't in the ordinance. And so I think that's where you start to run afoul of potentially state law. But there could be other factors to consider with a reduced setback, discussing with an applicant, like the height that is at that reduced setback. That would, I think, would be appropriate to have that discussion through the use permit, if that makes sense.
I think so, but I understand we're getting into very hypothetical territory. I'm assuming most applicants are not going to want to do that, so I can move on. Yeah, so just to kind of share my thought criteria as well, going through the list here. And yeah, I definitely appreciate staff bringing this to us at this stage so that we can have a chance to review and comment before anything is written up. I think Commissioner Schindler and the staff report mentions the housing element a few times, and I know that for City Council, adding housing is an important objective, and I think for myself as well, I want to see more housing added in Menlo Park. I know that's a state interest, obviously, with all these laws basically requiring ADUs to be allowed. So I'm supportive of that. I think, so then looking at our list of things to consider, the ways I was looking at it was, are these things adding, like for the non-state mandated ADUs, are we making it so that it's more flexible for the applicant, or are we adding some restrictions? So an example of restriction would be like limiting the size of the landing for the stairs. An example of something being more permissive would be, removing a parking requirement, for example. So that's kind of just ways I was looking at each of the things on the list. I'm definitely interested in streamlining the process for applicants. I guess just to share my personal experience, I don't remember the exact years, but I think in 2022, I filed an application to build an attached ADU at my residence, and it was completed. Well, I guess we got the final permit at the very beginning of this year. There were some delays, but yeah, I think I had some experiences that I thought could potentially be streamlined, and in general, marketing, the existence of these things and helping residents understand. We're having some trouble here on the dais understanding some of these regulations. So I'm sure for an average person looking at the code, it might be quite confusing. So as much as we can do to give, examples, and I've seen other cities do a really good job with that. San Jose comes to mind as an example. So I'm sure there's lots of materials we could produce of like 3D visuals of, what attached means attached, et cetera. But even just helping residents through the application process. An example of that would be the public comment we had from West Bay Sanitary. I wasn't aware of that. I'm a first-time homeowner, so I just wasn't aware that I needed a separate permit from a separate agency until much later. And so that was kind of a surprise I ran into as an example. And, I realize it's not necessarily the city's responsibility to figure all that out, but it would certainly be helpful, since kind of as a resident, the first person you think about going to when you're considering something within your home, whether that be an addition or an ADU or whatever, you think about the city. So that's number two. What can we do to help residents figure this out? And number three, yeah, I do think it's important for us to think about having these be, potentially separate dwelling units. I mean, a lot of the applications we see come through are large homes, very expensive, land acquisition costs, very expensive construction costs. And so I have trouble seeing the ADUs coming to us now as part of new construction being rented out the next day. Potentially they're being used for in-laws. But I know, talking to just folks on the street, there's definitely some concern that sometimes it's being used as like a pool house or something, or, a workspace. I don't know to what extent we can limit that, but just thinking 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when things change, at that point, having at least the potential for that dwelling unit to be easily rented out, I think is important. So things like separate access, fall into that camp for me. I think that is important, and not just having it be sort of additional square footage for the house, that if later it was to be a separate dwelling unit for a separate occupant, it would require a whole host of changes to be made. I think that would be kind of unfortunate overall. So yeah, those are kind of my overall criteria, and I have comments on some of the specific things. I share Commissioner Beruzzi's reluctance to kind of impose whether it be restrictions or flexibility outside of the state requirements. I would love to hear more from staff, and full disclosure, I sent this in an email, but I would love to hear more about the justification for those things. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? Maybe an example of an application where the homeowner ran into this or that issue, and now we're going to make it easier, or a homeowner built a stair landing that turned into a balcony, and then a neighbor was upset, and we don't want to do that anymore. Hearing those stories, I think, would really help us think through those things. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Commissioner Farrick.
Thank you, and thanks, Commissioner Sillen. Some of my discussion comments are touching on some of the same items, but framed maybe slightly differently. So at the risk of being slightly repetitive, I also first wanted to agree with Commissioners Beruzzi overall statement that right now bringing our ordinance into compliance with state law makes the most sense to me as well. And I just feel like without the data to understand what's happening with respect to the ADUs in Menlo Park, I have a difficult time weighing in on what are the smart changes, kind of to your just recent point. With that data, we would know, what is the most common, how are, those that are actually being rented and used by people outside of the main house. What are the elements that are successful? How large are they? What made it rentable? Why, are there common requests that could meet applicants' housing demand that could create this ordinance? That wouldn't result in just being workarounds that are clearly extra square footage for the main occupants of the house. I agree that the ordinance needs to address the new state legislation to adopt whatever the criteria is for some units becoming for sale eligible. And I think this should be considered part of bringing our local ordinance into compliance with state law. I just feel like without understanding, if there's several hundred out there, there's probably data to be had with anonymous surveys, or just understanding the inventory of what's been built and what the city knows about, the addresses or the people, the mailing, information. I'm not sure what's knowable, but even an anonymous survey just to understand what's happening, I think would help.
Vice Chair Silverstein.
I'm not ready with my overall points. I just want to respond to something about what Commissioner Farrick and Beruzzi mentioned, being the kind of primary priority being just compliance with state law. It says in the staff report that local ADU ordinances are optional, and if a jurisdiction does not have a local ordinance, then state law applies. So if the only thing we wanted to do as part of this process is to be in compliance with state law, we could just rescind or remove our current ordinance and then spend the time doing other things. I think my personal preference is to spend the time now while we have the opportunity and we're talking about this to actually address some of these things. Although I appreciate that the more information, the better, and we're potentially speaking from a point of naivete. That being said, I think if that is the way we want to go, then rescinding what we have would fulfill the purpose of being in compliance.
Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you. And then I think Commissioner Sillen was next. Sorry. I think I hear the sentiment and of compliance with state law being primary focus of commissioners, and it certainly is prominent here in the staff report. But I also want to highlight the other purpose of having a public ordinance, which has been alluded to here, right? It's a place people can go to get the information. So I feel strongly that we do have a set of Menlo Park headed ordinances framed in a way that makes sense to Menlo Park residents in the context of our broader zoning laws, right? It needs to be a chapter in the zoning laws where people go and they can find the section on ADU. And it's potentially that the content exclusively reflects state law. That is an option. I don't think that is the right option, nor do I think it's what's proposed here in the staff report. But I would certainly not go so far as to just say, let's just go with whatever the state has and tell people to go look up the state ordinances. If anything, I'd rather err on the side of making the ordinance document as close to the marketing material and the promotions and the explanatory stuff as we can. It simplifies it for creation and it simplifies it for consumption. I'll come back with more later.
Commissioner Sillon.
Thank you. Yeah, I realized that was something I was thinking about as well. So yeah, just a lot of meetings we've had, we review use permits where you have to get a permit, you know, if you're within X number of feet of the residence, but then if you're within Y number of feet, you don't need a use permit. And we ask staff, you know, like, how do we come up with that number? And we're not sure. And so looking at some of these recommendations from staff, I think to me, it kind of appears similar where, for example, you know, we're saying we're going to limit, I forget the exact language, but stair landings to 20% of the ADU size. And so I can see 10 years from now thinking like, well, why was it 20%? Why wasn't it 15 or 25? I think if anything, it would be helpful to note that somewhere so that someone doesn't have to like look through meeting minutes to understand. But also, yeah, again, having more background from staff to help us think through these things would be helpful. I think in terms of the ordinance, this is way out of my league, but my thinking would be we could still educate the public on what the city requirement or the state requirements are rather without putting them in our ordinance for duplicity's sake, especially since the rules keep changing every year. So perhaps would be better off putting less things in our local ordinance to avoid the situation where we're having to update it all the time as rules change. Of course, that would require staff to somehow, you know, foresee what's going to be changed and what's not, which would be hard. But I think we could still educate the public on what the rules are without putting them in our ordinance just to have them changed a year from now by the state, and then the local version doesn't match the state version, which probably causes more confusion. I guess I would love to know from staff how it happened that our current ordinance is so doesn't match the state. Is it that in 2020, when some of these laws started coming out, or even before, we had all of these restrictions on ADUs, and then now they're not allowed? Or was it that we just basically copied the state rules and then the state rules changed, so then now we're having to update it because of that? Yeah, I would just be curious to know what happened in 2020 and what the justifications were at that time for some of the things we had in our ordinance by the Planning Commission, if any, because that would help us understand what the mindset was and what our mindset should be moving forward.
Thank you for your question. Just wanted to think that through a little bit. Appreciate the time to reflect. But yes, in 2020, there were some comprehensive updates that the state provided then that established a lot of statewide ADU requirements. And prior to 2020, I don't think there were a lot of like rigid requirements in place. It was a little more, I think, subject to different jurisdictional expectations, and the state had less, I think, regulatory mechanisms in place. And following 2020, a series of, I would say, more housing-driven initiatives occurred. I would say perhaps, in concert with SB 330 and other state-led housing initiatives based on the state housing affordability crisis and all these other issues going on in this decade. And I think that has resulted in, over some time, the last 5 years, a series of major assembly bills and Senate bills that have all translated into ensuring there are more opportunities for ADUs to be built, and that jurisdictions have less of a say in preventing ADUs in their jurisdiction. So I think it was also a reflection of making sure all of the state has the same set of rules for guaranteeing some forms of ADU housing and getting a broader kind of ability to do that statewide.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say is I'm understanding the HED's letter is not saying that we need to go and add all of these new requirements to our ordinance because, like Vice Chair Silverstein said, if it's not in our ordinance, then the state law applies by default. So my understanding is what they're saying is that we have things that are in conflict with the state rules in our local ordinance that needs to be updated. So I'm just wondering, are the things that are in conflict things that like the previous planning commission wanted to restrict and now we can't, or are they just things that we put in our ordinance from previous state laws that have since then changed?
I think it's kind of a mixed response. Unfortunately, it's rather nuanced. And admittedly, perhaps if we had some kind of comparison table that just several pages long, every single thing, why every single thing is different, and maybe the reasoning behind each change. There are a lot of factors at play, but I would say that the main thing is, one, I think ADUs have evolved in terms of definitions and types. So there are different varieties of ADUs, and what constitute ADUs in today's more, I guess, 2025 sense versus 2020. So that's one factor that I think creates some issues with how we're defining ADUs currently in our existing ordinance. There's conflict there. There are also some conflicts with, I believe, some of the development standards that we've applied. And then additionally, we have some other, I believe, kind of use permit triggers and other things that we kind of set up a sort of discretionary implication where there should not be any more. And so it's hard for me to give you a very detailed answer, but I think in short, we have some more restrictive qualities, and I think some of them are preventing the guaranteed allowance. That's one of the fundamental things. I think we have a few circumstances, I believe, in our ordinance where it's not clear that an 800 square foot ADU could happen on a certain properties based on the zoning, based on the size of the lot, and so on. And we have to, one, yes, by default, that is the law. This is what has to happen moving forward. But also, we would also need to, if we're updating our ordinance, change the language to ensure that we're carving out these kind of pockets of opportunities for these different types of properties, whether it's multifamily or single family, and whether it's, varieties of ADUs that we've gone over, not including the attached ADU, but the internal ADU, JADUs, and the certain types of detached ADUs as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that clarifies it. I think just my comment would be that we as a planning commission should think about what things we want to add on top of what the state is saying. I've definitely seen cases where, a city might restrict something and then a year later it's, the state says you can't. I don't think a lot of the things on staff's list right now are like that. I don't imagine, for example, lighting having to be a certain way would be something that gets overridden, but we should just be thoughtful about what we want to choose to restrict moving forward, but also, yeah, keeping in mind potential. I would love to hear about what things residents have brought up in the past that we should consider in that regard.
Okay, it's 9:05, and so I want to take a quick break and then come back and hear some more discussion. So I'm going to have us take a brief recess and reconvene at 9:10 p.m. Thank you. Sorry.
Commissioner Farrick wants to vote on whether or not we get to go, we get a break.
I believe that's my prerogative. Okay, it is 9:10 p.m. So I am going to call us back to order. Mr. Ball, can you please do not be rushed, but give me a thumbs up when we're good to go. Okay. Vice Chair Silverstein.
Let's get into it. Okay, so with my general thoughts on ADUs, I have two themes that I'd like to center things around. One is simplicity and the other is permissibility. On simplicity, I know that the California minimums are nuanced and they've dealt in that nuance, and I don't think we need to. And there are a number of circumstances where we have different standards applied. For example, attached versus detached ADUs, or half mile to transit versus not, or existing dwellings versus proposed dwellings. And I feel like all of that leads to more confusion, and as per what Commissioner Sillen was talking about, a seemingly arbitrary nature of our zoning code that someone's then going to ask, why is it this way, or why are we differentiating with those? And we can go into redlining the specifics if we want to, or when we're ready to get there. My general preference would be to not carve out those differences and just to allow for the more permissible ADU across the board. So one example is California says, by right, you have a 16-foot ADU unless you're close to transit, and then you get an 18-foot height limit. I don't feel like we would need to apply a distinction between that, and we should just do the 18-foot in that example. Or if we have various carve-outs based on those differences, I think that it waters down the product and makes it more confusing. And then on permissibility, the whole purpose of this, the reason why we would have a zoning ordinance around ADUs is for the purpose of allowing more ADUs than the state minimum. By definition, the state minimum is the minimum. And I do not see a point of having this discussion if we are not going above that minimum. We want more housing in Menlo Park. I think that's very clear through our housing element. I think that's very clear through City Council's priorities. And that's very clear through the state. We want to incentivize ADUs, and to whatever extent we can use our ordinance to incentivize those ADUs. I'm sure there are people on the margin who will say, well, it wasn't economical for me to build an 800 square foot ADU because imputed rents would be X. But if I had the ability to build a 1,200 foot ADU, then imputed rents would be Y, and therefore that's worth it. And that is strictly an additional housing unit in Menlo Park. And so for the purposes of tonight, I would hope and love if we as a commission could come together with some, as opposed to each individual commissioner just giving their general feedback, I would hope that we could come together on some very pointed proposals on where we could and should take Menlo Park's ADU ordinance and what standards we should set. And so I can either propose specific things. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to talk about their generic preferences, but I think before tonight is over, I would love for us to talk about the actual specifics on what we might want to see in terms of, again, simplicity and permissibility. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and express my thoughts. I'm going to have some quick framing and then some specific things that I would like to provide feedback on. So I would also like us to see the city lean into the permissibility and utility of ADUs. I think it's pretty clear. I agree with what all the commissioners have said around more data would be nice. I think the data that we do have is that ADUs have been very popular in Menlo Park. Lots of people have built them. The fact that lots of people have built them is one of two reasons, as far as I can recall, why the city is currently on track to meet its housing goals. And I think it's a reasonable debate as to whether or not the ADUs we've seen so far are or are not adding the types of units we might want to see. But just personally, especially given the discussions at City Council over the last few weeks, I am just very concerned about the city's ability to meet our housing goals. And I think if we don't meet our housing goals, that is bad because we don't have enough housing. And because I think the loss of local control and the introduction of the chaos of builder's remedy is just bad for the city. It takes up enormous amounts of city staff and public time, and it's very bad. And if ADUs are a way to help us avoid a situation where we don't meet our housing goals, then I think we need to take seriously how we make sure that ADUs help us do that. That's one. Second, and again, I'll say I agree with, given the choice of having net new units or just more square feet for bigger houses, I would take net new units, but I'm also not against larger houses. I want Menlo Park, I have a large family. I would like Menlo Park to be friendly to large families. I think large houses are good for that. And I think ADUs have been an important contributor to that goal. And so for those reasons, or those are the lenses with which I'm looking at this draft. That being said, I have a couple specific comments. First, in terms of the issue of exterior and interior access, I am, building on what Commissioner Sillen said, I am in favor of a requirement to provide separate exterior access to an ADU. I am not in favor, and I think we should, I am strongly not in favor and very concerned at the appearance in this draft of a prohibition on interior access between houses and attached ADUs. I think it's very reasonable that we require exterior access so that units can be rented separately, but I think prohibiting interior access makes it a lot less likely that people will build ADUs, and I am very concerned about the consequences of that per my prior statements on framing. My understanding from reading the staff report is that this is an objective standard that the city is considering, but that we do not have to apply it, and I am first and foremost quite concerned about the implications of doing so. That's number one specific point. My second specific point is that I would like to see us increase the maximum floor area in our objective development standards. My understanding from reading the state ADU handbook is that if the city does not have a separate ADU ordinance, the maximum floor area for an ADU is 1,200 square feet. That's just sort of what it defaults to. And so our current objective development standards have a maximum floor areas of 850 for one bedroom or 1,000 square feet for more than one bedroom ADUs. I would like to see us increase those maximum floor areas to at least 1,200 square feet. I would be interested in looking at 1,400 square feet, but I think we're in a sense being more restrictive than the state default. And so I would like to see us increase maximum floor areas to 1,200 square feet. That's point number two. Point number three, sort of along those same lines, is that that maximum floor area currently is the lesser of a absolute number, in this case, 1,000 square feet, I believe, or 50% of the existing dwelling. I am not in favor of that second part about the 50% of the existing dwelling. I don't think people should be penalized for having smaller lots or smaller houses. If someone with a small existing house wants to build 1,000 square foot ADU, that's awesome. We should be encouraging that and not restricting their ability to do so because their current house is small. That's my third point. And then my last and fourth point is relatively minor, but just the current requirement that an ADU have an exterior access pathway from the public right-of-way. This is quite detailed, but I currently own a home where I could imagine there being an ADU, the access from which would be from an easement, rather, which I don't know if that qualifies as a public right-of-way or not. And so I would just ask staff to look at that. That fourth point is far less important than the first three. I will leave it there.
Really quickly, is that easement an alley? Because I know there are lots of alleys in at least the Willows neighborhood.
This particular easement is, well, I don't even know what an alley is. I don't think it's an alley, but I would ask staff to look at whether or not the requirement to be from a public right-of-way would, like the natural place to build paths to ADUs might be from alleys or easements or something like that. And so I think it's worth thinking about.
Thank you, Chair. We can certainly look into that matter and follow up. Thank you.
Commissioner Baruzzi.
Can you clarify or explain a little more the recommendation about the interior access? It sounded like from the report there was something that you detected that we were out of compliance with our city building code. I just want to understand that a little bit more.
Sure, I'll take that one. Let's see. So we are yes, good question or good point. The city has allowed internal access. We have been looking at that as it relates to the California Residential Code within the California Building Code. That is a state code. The city does implement it. And so it does appear that there should be greater limitations per that code, per the California Building Code, or specifically the California Residential Code, on internal access between an ADU and a main dwelling. So the staff recommendation from the planning side and in the ordinance notwithstanding, the state mandate and non-state mandate ADUs do need to comply with the California Building Code, in this case, the California Residential Code for 2-unit developments. And so we're currently looking at the 2025 California Building Code, which includes the 2025 CRC or California Residential Code, for what limit or what allowances for access would be. But if there are any, they would be very limited per the building code. So that will supersede any zoning ordinance that's in effect.
If I could, if state law is what it is, then of course that has to supersede our local law. I guess what I would say is I am not aware of most or a lot of cities in California that are prohibiting interior access between ADUs for this reason. So if that is part of state law, I would expect most, if not all, cities in California to be prohibiting it, in which case, okay, then that's a state issue. If it is the case that Menlo Park is simply taking a more restrictive view of that code, I would not be in favor of that, and I would argue stringently against that. So I think staff should continue to look at it. Obviously, this is a study session, but just foreshadowing that if we're just taking a more restrictive view of this code, in my opinion, that's not the way the city should be going, given our other goals. If this is state law, then okay, it's state law, and that's a separate issue. Commissioner Baruzzi, I interrupted you, so if you have further comments. Okay. Commissioner Schindler.
Thank you, Chair. I may should just briefly comment on the interior door issue, and then if I may sort of take the first chunk of topics as they're organized in the staff report under the heading of the mandatory state regulatory changes, and just quickly go through and provide feedback on a section by section basis, because I think that was at least part of the request. As it relates to the interior door, I very much appreciate Commissioner or Chair Eric's point about it may cause some folks to say, I'm not going to do this if I can't have a door between the ADU space and my primary residence. However, I actually think it is an improvement in the probability of the new space, the ADU space, becoming a true housing unit. I think the fact that if the absence of an interior door and a link between the two things is, if the space is built, much more likely to cause someone to think about, can it be rented? Can it actually be an independent living unit, and create a situation where we have more than one family unit in a given space. And that may not be for the person who builds it, but it may be for the people who come after them or the people who come after them. And that's always something that I'm trying to keep in mind as we talking about these ADUs. They may get built in one context, but 5 years or 6 years later, and then 12 years after that, and then 18 years after that, it's a different family with a different context, or the same family with a different need, an adult child, an elderly parent. Things evolve over time. So I am actually in favor of promoting, or at least publicizing, how about this? If it's law about the interior doors, I think obviously we need to respect that. And I would certainly want to put it in the ADU ordinances where people could find it when they're thinking about their ADU. And I don't think it's something to, I think it's something to sort of be seriously considered as creating new units. Okay. Just sort of following the structure of the section of the staff report where we're talking about mandatory state regulatory changes. There's a section about parking, which is laying out the requirements, but then poses some other questions as it relates to non-state mandated ADUs. I would be in favor of removing any parking restrictions that we can. I think the question is specifically about state mandated units, so toss them. Let the people with the property make the decision. The second question was about processing timelines. You specifically introduced the appeals process and laid out some of the logistics for how an appeals process would work. The part that seemed to be, you seemed to be seeking feedback on was the part that the state didn't mandate, which is exactly who the hearing body is for the appeals process. And it names, the proposal in the staff report names the Planning Commission. And my first report was, wow, that doesn't seem quite right. But we don't want more of those things. But when I thought through who else it could be, who else the hearing body could be, right? I thought about staff and I said, well, you can't really ask the staff to appeal their own work. City council, that would be a very poor use of city council resources. Third-party consultants, that would just be expensive. So upon further contemplation, I couldn't come up with a better answer than the Planning Commission. If there's another option that I haven't thought of, it would be nice to hear about that when we discuss it next time. But for now, it sounds like the most logical alternative to me. I don't have any additional feedback on the questions or the outline about the number of overall ADUs. Other than to say that I agree with the staff recommendations not to allow additional ADUs beyond what is permitted by state law. That's because of the principle I outlined earlier, which is trying to keep things straightforward so we don't have to go back and revise our ordinances as the state evolves. I don't have any concerns or questions about putting in the fire, sanitary, or sewer requirements in the ADU ordinances. Because of the principle that it makes those ordinances function more like a handbook, which I think was highlighted in the staff report. As it relates to amnesty, I understand the idea of sort of moving the amnesty date forward. Right now, we allow for amnesty from January 1st, 2020. I wouldn't want the amnesty date to be moved up to like yesterday, because I would like the state to believe that we have been enforcing the regulations like, at some point. To me, the staff report of the idea, the suggestion about doing it to the date of the housing element seemed logical, but I don't really have a strong opinion about that. Okay, I'll pause and allow and have other commissioners speak. I do have just some additional final thoughts on the questions posed in the local objective standards, but I'll hand the mic.
Commissioner Farrick.
Thank you. Just so that kind of sequentially, hopefully it's helpful for the team for note taking, I'll kind of weigh in on some of the same items in the same order that Commissioner or Chair Eric and Commissioner Schindler just weighed in on, and Commissioner Silverstein too. My comment, I appreciate the desire for simplicity, and I agree, and permissibility. I agree to the extent that state laws are already quite permissible with respect to ADUs, and it's the most simple solution to restate and link to these relevant laws from our own building codes. They're changing, and to keep up, I think that would be the most straightforward rather than trying to create very specific square footages and various things without the data. I hope that we can get some before the next time that we see this, like something that would indicate why we might change the square footage beyond 850 or permiss more. So back to the order of things. Exterior access, yes, agreed. Support continued requirement for the unit to be accessed from the exterior. Interior, I am mixed. I appreciate Commissioner Schindler's perspective. I agree that it would probably create more potential for units and kind of tamp down on just the square footage grab. However, the scenario that is front of mind for me is the caregiver, elderly caregiver in a multi-tenant. If there's like, the caregiver lives in the unit and there's multiple people that are in need of care for whatever reason. So that access might be challenging depending on the situation. So I'm I'm not quite sure how to write an ordinance that both meets those needs, but incentivizes the behavior we want to see with an actual unit. And then floor area maximums. Yeah, I don't agree with Chair Eric on this. I feel like we would need to know why this is an important thing, particularly with more than half the lots in town being so small. I agree with the staff report recommending that at least daylight plane requirements are maintained, because of what I don't want is for really good ADU design. I want that to continue, and what I don't want is a proliferation of overbuilt lots where there's then difficult issues with neighbors and neighborhoods that then becomes a backlash about ADUs in general. And I also agree, though, we don't want to penalize small lot owners from participating in ADUs. So, for whatever reason, 850 seems to be a magical number that seems to work both with the state and with most of our lots. It seems to be a size that's also functional. I don't know the finances, the impact there that Commissioner Eric had mentioned. Exterior access from the public right-of-way, I just feel like we don't need to make this more onerous than state requirements, nor, I guess I'm kind of neutral on, I just would like to make sure that we're adhering, at least to state requirements. And I'm not sure requiring beyond that is a necessary update. So I also agree with Commissioner Schindler that I'm in favor of removing a requirement for a covered space for parking. I hope that's helpful. It was kind of sort of in the order in which everybody else talked about it.
Commissioner Sillen.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on what Vice Chair Silverstein said about, it's not really worth the conversation unless we're trying to encourage ADUs more than the state. I think I generally agree with that. There are some minute details that I think are worth considering, but outside of that, but yeah, within that framing, I have a few ideas, but I did want to just ask staff if there's any specific examples that come to mind of homeowners who wanted to add an ADU and maybe even submit an application, but then realized it wasn't going to work for reasons that could be adjusted in the zoning code. If there's any examples like that, or if staff has any suggestion of okay, if the goal of our planning commission is to encourage more ADUs, what does staff think are the biggest hurdles right now for homeowners when looking at our zoning code that make them go maybe not right now, or not for me?
Thank you for that. It's a very important and definitely thought-provoking question. I think there's a lot of nuance, as with many of the topics, but it's hard to pinpoint without some generalization. And I think one major item I think this is very nuanced. It's probably going to be more expanded response than you'd like, but the process and overall timeline, I think, is a major issue for a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in ADUs, whether it's a developer, a homeowner, someone interested in maybe moving into an ADU. A lot of the actual processing that we have in terms of our review timelines overall is more complicated and lengthy. And I think that's a reflection of just kind of the current regulations, but also a lot of the procedures, and state law, I think, is helping to streamline that. So I think there's going to be an improvement there. So that helps for one aspect. And I think also, as mentioned in the staff report, we have the pre-approved ADU program, which we are still working on. We unfortunately don't have any currently available, but once we have some that we can approve, we're hopeful that that can really speed things up in terms of just limiting the amount of zoning review that's necessary, the amount of effort that staff would need to put into reviews and comments and follow-up. So I'd say that that's one topic of concern. Other items of concern, I think we have more available options for ADUs now than ever before. So I think perhaps previously there was more of a limitation on how one could convert an existing, building, perhaps a garage, a shed, but there's more flexibility built in with state law. There's a lot with how junior ADUs and attached ADUs can be built that have, I think, improved over time with just setbacks and different requirements. We had before, for example, I believe a more rigid understanding of front setback requirements. And I think sometimes the front was at times the only area that might work for certain development reasons. For example, just one example. But I think besides that, I don't think there are any other really clear issues. I think some of the development standards could be seen as a hurdle. You may be maxed out. Maybe there could also be an issue with the layout of the lot if you have a very large development in terms of the main residence, primary residence being so large. Maybe the footprint is so large, and there's not a lot of land remaining. If sometimes you'd have homeowners or property owners, I should say, that may reflect on wanting a yard space, some kind of outdoor space that's in the property. How do they negotiate that, but also add on to the built kind of environment in their property itself? So I think those are generally some of the issues. Again, a generalization, not really a great deal of detail to add beyond that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. I was thinking about setbacks. So my understanding is for setbacks right now, the state requirement is 4 feet on the sides and rear. Is that correct? And then for the front, it's there's could you talk about the front setbacks? I believe there's different cases where different ones apply.
Yes, that could vary. Initially, we've had a change with state law that's required us to rethink how we were applying it for detached ADUs. But detached ADUs, for example, do not have a specific limitation on front setbacks. We had once, I think, had something before in our requirements that we've since, it's outdated. And we need to now just allow for detached ADUs and no restriction in that sense. Apart from, again, going back to building code, fire safety, fire rating, there are other factors here that go beyond kind of the planning and our purview per se. But I think that's one major factor. With the side and rear, that's kind of been the same. Other front setback details to factor in. With an attached ADU, we had earlier required to match the main residence, the primary residence setback. A lot of the single family zoning is 20 foot for a front setback. So that's a big deal that, the 20 feet in front of a residence perhaps is not possible for an addition. But that now is being, rethought with this update and with state law. And that is a little difficult and technical to explain, but it basically is requiring us to think of the front setback in relation to what it would take to build the guaranteed 800 square foot ADU that could still have a side and rear setback meeting the requirement. I think the rear setback doesn't really matter in this case if it's all in the front, but I think if you think about the full development of the lot, what kind of square footage you have to work with, what kind of buildable footprint, buildable area you have, you would have a certain set of limitations if you only had for example, the classic, R1U type lot that's 50 feet wide, and it has a driveway, and there's a parking access point, and maybe you want to keep that garage. Now you're losing maybe 10 to 15 feet on the side of the house, perhaps. So you only have maybe 25 to 35 feet in front of your house by 20. That's maybe like a 450 to 500 square foot footprint, as an example. I think that's a very extreme example, but there could be situations where the front of the property would need to still meet the 4-foot side, and then have the 800 square foot allowance, and that would depend on certain factors. But there's more capability now than before.
Yeah, I'm seeing that the staff report says that for front setbacks, it says whatever setback is necessary to enable the construction of an 800 square foot ADU. I guess when we talk about necessary, like in the case where a homeowner wants to keep their backyard or something like that, like what does necessary really mean? Who defines necessary? That doesn't seem very objective, I suppose.
If I may, through the chair, I'm just going to look at the staff report for a moment. Sorry.
So it's a good question. We were just discussing. So appreciate the question about like objective here. It's staff's understanding that this is per state law. We do need to allow for an 800 square foot minimum ADU, potentially in the front setback, and whether or not it is necessary for the hypothetical that was just raised, staff would not, the city would not be able to say no to an ADU in the front setback, as long as it is 800 square feet or less, if that makes sense, because that is a state mandated requirement. And so the ordinance is set up to help provide that clarity to the broader community in Menlo Park that per state law there is this allowance for a 800 square foot ADU that can encroach into the front setback as necessary. Understand that as necessary could be subjective, but it is really intended to comply with state law and provide that allowance.
Okay, thanks. That's clear. Yeah, in terms of like what we could do to further allow ADUs, I know there's an example in San Diego where they allowed more ADUs on multifamily properties if some of them were deed restricted affordable. But then I remember reading an article recently that there was community pushback on that because developers started putting a lot of ADUs on properties. I know in Oregon, also in Portland, you can add like up to like 8 ADUs to a single family home. I believe in Portland, they allow you to sell them separately. And there's also different conditions as to how many you can add. And I think it depends on the lot size and all that stuff. So I guess the biggest levers to me we could pull would be like, how many ADUs can you add? What's the square footage of those ADUs? It sounds like setbacks for the most part are not a factor. I know, I think it was in Redwood City or Foster City, there was a neighbor that built an ADU basically like up against the sidewalk essentially. And people weren't happy about that. So there's definitely trade-offs here with each one. I don't want to take the 800 square foot, mandated by the state as like, okay, well, that's good enough and we should stay there. I also have trouble thinking of what the number should be. So I guess I tend to sort of just think, okay, could we consider giving more flexibility in terms of, just going up to that maximum, which I think is 1,200 square feet that's required by state for all ADUs, state mandated or not. So essentially allowing bigger ADUs, I assume, would encourage more people to build one. Also, my question to staff obviously is like, what things have they seen? Doesn't include people that have looked at our website, have talked to an architect, and then decided not to do anything about it. So we don't know what people are sitting on the sidelines that aren't, applying. But I would have to imagine square footage is a consideration. Yeah, in terms of number, I don't know. I'd have to think through that one a little more. Like allowing more than one ADU on a lot. I know there's certain cases where you can on a single family lot, but and also, going back to data, like what we see here a lot is new family home construction, new single family home construction, and a lot of those recent applications seem to be including ADUs. What we don't know and what we don't see are people like myself, they're adding ADUs to existing homes because those are ministerial approved. So we never see those applications to begin with. And so we're not really sure, I guess, or I'm not really sure what types of homes are adding ADUs to existing buildings, and are there certain categories of homeowners that have been turned away by our zoning code from doing so, and that would be really nice to know. So I don't have any like obvious slam dunk suggestions besides perhaps increasing the square footage that we allow. And the staff report, I believe on page, bear with me 1 second. Well, in table 2, that's page 9 of the staff report, mentions ADU square footage shall not exceed 50% of an existing primary dwelling or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. So I believe that's saying essentially that you can't go over 1,000 in any case. And then there's another statement on page 11 of the staff report that mentions that under ADU square footage at the very bottom of that page, it says, state law is clear that an ADU cannot exceed 50% of the existing primary residence or 850 square feet for studio 1-bedroom units and 1,000 square feet for units with 2 or more bedrooms, whichever is less. I believe that's incorrect. Looking at the ADU handbook offered by HCD, there's even a specific, like in the Q&A, which there's a specific question. It's on page 40 of the handbook that says, can maximum unit sizes exceed 1,200 square feet for ADUs? It says, yes, maximum unit sizes can exceed 1,200 square feet for ADUs through the adoption of a less stringent local ADU ordinance. Right above that, it says, can a percentage of the primary dwelling be used to limit the maximum size of an attached ADU? It says yes, but only if it does not restrict the ADU size to less than 800 square feet, 850 square feet, or 1,000 square feet. And then on a previous page, there's a question, can minimum and maximum unit sizes be established for ADUs? As well in that answer, I believe it always says that those are all minimums, not maximums. Like, for example, for local agencies without a compliant ADU ordinance, maximum unit sizes are 1,200 square feet, but we could go over that with our local ordinance. So the sky's the limit, it seems, but at the very least, I don't think we should be setting the maximum at 850. Anything below 1,200, I suppose, seems more restrictive than what the state is saying would happen without the ordinance. Outside of that, I don't have any thoughts on how we can incentivize more ADUs, but I'd love to hear them from other commissioners.
Vice Chair Silverstein.
Yeah, I just want to cover the 2 points that have been discussed most recently on interior access and square footage. Regarding interior access, Commissioner Schindler, I want to probe if you contradicted yourself by talking about how over a very long horizon, the use cases of ADUs can vary, and then subsequent homeowners can envision different purposes for those ADUs, be it a kid home from college or parents or a nanny or another house or another family living there. And if we restrict the interior access in the first place, while I totally agree the percentage of ADUs built that would be initially for the purpose of secondary housing would certainly rise, I imagine that the total number of ADUs would significantly go down, and therefore it wouldn't provide the opportunity in the first place for those use cases to deviate and migrate. And so if we're disincentivizing the initial build of the ADU, then the family who wants to move in there next doesn't have the opportunity to envision what this ADU could become because it was never built in the first place. And so that's my biggest concern around not building them. I agree with all of the points that, to some extent, a lot of the ADUs we see are a little bit of a wink and a nod around this is extended square footage to my primary residence. But the fact that they are being built in the first place allows for the next family and the family after that. And it does provide the creativity and opportunity for people to change the nature of those ADUs over time. And I think without the interior access, we lose that opportunity. So that's the first topic. On height, on overall square footage for ADUs, I would be pretty disappointed if we, as a city, adopted the state minimum for our ADUs. I think Menlo Park doesn't have a great reputation of pushing the envelope for allowing for very permissible building. And I think we're in a housing crisis. And I don't use that word lightly. I do consider it a crisis that I've heard every single person on the Planning Commission, I've heard everyone on City Council, and I've read a lot of pages of plans that our city has adopted that says we want more housing. And if the reason why we would not allow for more square footage in an ADU is because we just feel like there's going to be some community pushback or the neighbor's not going to like it, or we're worried that someone is going to get too much house on their lot, that doesn't sit with me for the purposes of actually incentivizing it. And it doesn't mean that every ADU is going to be maxed out, and it doesn't mean that we're going to have 100% at the 1,200 rate or whatever we wanted to make it, but it would certainly allow for the marginal ADU. Commissioner Solon, I don't think we will ever get data on the people who would want to build an ADU and weren't able to by seeing that the only permissible size was 800 square feet to date. But I'm sure they're there because we work on the margins. And I'm not proposing to take it to an extreme where we would just allow any square footage, but the state minimum seems insufficient, not only from a visceral standpoint, but also just thinking about it. It seems fine if we truly consider ADUs to be accessory in nature. And I understand the word ADU has the word, or the acronym ADU has the word accessory in there, but it is sufficient for a nanny and it is sufficient for aging parents, but 850 square feet is not sufficient as a standalone housing unit for a family who might want to live in there. Certainly it is under certain circumstances, and people will adapt to whatever they need to in terms of circumstances. And I'm sure there are thousands of people who would love to live in Menlo Park under 850 square feet, but there are even more who would love to live in Menlo Park at 1,000 square feet or 1,100. And to whatever extent we can allow for that and allow for that flexibility, I think that's something that we should entertain. And then I guess I have a question if other people want to talk about heights, because that's something that I know there are 3 possible height limits for different types of ADUs. And I wrote down in my notes that I would love to give a recommendation to staff to try to simplify that. But no one mentioned that in their notes.
So if no one cares about it, then we
I
don't.
would support that.
I would also support 20 feet in order to be able to get to 2 stories more easily.
Great. I would too.
Can I make a couple of comments?
Commissioner Baruzzi, please go ahead.
So I've been trying to figure out how to articulate what I want to say tonight in a way that makes it appropriate. I recently looked at, I noticed that that Menlo Park was recently featured in a report by, of all places, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank. And they were talking about the McMansionification of communities in California. And they were pointing out that one of the biggest risks for community, or one of the biggest contributing factors to communities like ours, one of the challenges with, I'm sorry, I did not get enough sleep this week. Having trouble forming my words. Let me see if I can express this succinctly. We have a huge opportunity cost every time a single family lot is redeveloped, because it could, in theory, especially some of the larger lots that we're seeing, become a sort of light touch, gentle, like slight densification, where we could say put 8 townhomes that would be missing middle housing that people would actually purchase on a lot that's currently restricted. We're currently restricting it to a big house with a junior ADU and another ADU and another ADU, right? And I think we're all kind of dancing around how to do something that approximates that thing that we're looking for, which is creating more homes that will actually be used as more homes. And it's disappointing to me that back in the early discussions of the housing element, that our city didn't grapple more earnestly with whether or not we wanted to address that first issue. It became like a third rail in Menlo Park politics and got taken off the table very quickly. But I just wanted to pose for the record that if even conservative think tanks are saying, why aren't people doing this? And they deem Menlo Park to be at particularly high risk of having all of our housing, available land quickly converting into these large new homes, which means they won't be redeveloped again for another 20 or 30 years, then maybe it's time to look at that again. And to the point about size, I'm getting back to our ADU points. I think there is an interesting opportunity here. The fact that the state has introduced laws that would allow us to basically create for sale units, and the fact that we aren't producing a lot of missing middle housing. We're producing apartments and we're producing ADUs that we don't know that are getting rented, but that we're functioning as small apartments. And we're producing a whole lot of big single family homes. I think it is worth looking at the combination effect of allowing larger ADUs than the state minimum and leveraging that new state law that says that people should be able to sell them. I think that could be a really promising additional form of housing in our city. I would also echo what others have said about the interior doors. If it's a law and your interpretation is as generous as it can be, then I guess that's what we have to do. But I think every time one of these lots gets redeveloped and we're missing an opportunity to add more housing units there, that's a bummer. So I would like to do whatever we can to make sure that people are incentivized to build additional units and that it's not too onerous. Those are my main points. So yes to better to liberalizing height and square footage restrictions. Would not like to make anything. I don't think we should add parking restrictions where they don't currently exist. I would liberalize that as well. I will say one thing about the parking restrictions, which is right now we have an ordinance in most of our neighborhoods that says you can't park on the street between 2 and 5 a.m. And I don't think our city, I think when we talk about removing parking minimums, people in our community forget about that. And they often talk about, oh, you know, we're going to have all these cars on our street overnight. I think as long as we're continuing to enforce that ordinance and we're not granting overrides, like doing more of these on-street parking permits because somebody didn't build enough parking on their off-street ADU, then that's fine. I think there really genuinely are people who are looking for residences that don't need parking. And I would generally leave parking at the individual home just as we do. I would basically let the owner who's building it decide whether or not they think they have a more rentable unit if they add an extra parking space, or whether they can use that land some other way.
Okay, we're rounding 10 o'clock. I don't want to restrict anyone, but I think there has been a lot of good discussion tonight, and it seems like we're circling around a few key points. I am tracking that. I believe Commissioner Schindler said that she had some additional points, so
Yeah,
maybe I'll go to her and then we'll see where we
I
are.
shall make it quick.
No pressure. I was just saying. Go ahead.
Talk faster is what you know. I really appreciate the comments from other commissioners about looking at the interior door issue from a couple of different perspectives and looking at the size issue from a couple of different perspectives. And to directly address Commissioner Sillon's question, like, yes, it's I see the tension between, does it exist? And once it exists, once the additional space exists, are you limiting how it can be used in the future? I see the tension. And the good news is I don't actually feel like I now have to make a call, because I feel like it's actually a requirement in the building code anyways. But I think that's going to end up in there. But I see the tension. I appreciate the sort of the dialogue. On the topic of maximum sizes, I think I started the meeting today with the perspective of sticking with the state recommendations or what was in the staff report. Because I think my hope, and I think now when I started, I thought, you know what, we should just, if we're going to talk about building an additional big house on your lot, let's talk about SB 9. Let's talk about sort of actually building another, not extra large ADU. Let's talk about another like real housing unit. And I am not enough of an expert as to what's being discussed at the state level to talk about whether having extra large ADUs would somehow put us in the way of things that are happening with SB 9. But if there's nothing coming down the pipe, like, it does actually sound like, especially if we can do the part that was brought up about being able to sell, right? Having an extra large sized ADU and then potentially having the ability to sell it. That approximates some things that that the state is trying to do and the city is trying to do. So I'm moving in that direction, dependent on feedback about things that are happening on the state level. I do want to just weigh in on, just very quickly, I swear, Chair, on just the questions that were posed in here, because I appreciate that staff went through the effort of developing the proposals and writing this all up with a healthy degree of context. These are under the local objective standard proposals. There's a discussion here about when internal ADU conversions happen and some of the criteria that happen around this. My reading of the staff report is that this matches what Commissioner Sillon was talking about. Like, where are there cases where people have been concerned about something? So my read of the staff report is that maybe there were instances where people wanted to have a footprint that was smaller rather than identical when they did a reconstruction. So I think the language that's proposed in there about being able to have the same sized or smaller footprint is of benefit to people who are reconstructing and would like to have an ADU. It makes a ton of sense to me. I believe that keeping the daylight plane logically makes sense that it's proposed in here. Having additions where they're happening of the up to 150 square foot within a 4 feet setback makes sense to me. It's the same logic of having the setback in that it protects neighbors. We've already talked about on exterior access, the direct weather safe park. I've already given feedback to strike the word direct. There's a statement in here about Stair and landings meeting the 4-foot setback. I think that makes sense. It gives the neighbors a little bit more protection, and it sort of sticks to the concept of a 4-foot setback and what that's supposed to represent. There's language in here about having the stair and landing being no greater than the minimum size. I disagree with that. I think it makes the ADUs less useful. I think if coverage and building area allow for there to be a landing or a stair larger than the absolute minimum required for safety and fire, they should be allowed to make that decision. Similar to logic that applies with the covered porches. A landing may actually be a very useful thing that makes a unit more usable and therefore and eventually more rentable. Covered porches was brought up. I believe the specific question was, is it 20, is it 15, is it 50? Like, I'm going to presume that staff has a reasonable sort of just either historical context or benchmarking off of other things to have picked the 20%. It makes sense to me to have that limitation in order to keep things regulated by the ADU ordinance, or keep the covered porches regulated by ADU ordinance rather than other structures. As it relates to the exterior lighting, I would like to confirm that what's proposed here would apply to all ADUs, whether they're state mandated or not. So that's my first question to staff. Would
The answer is no.
okay. Okay, so just ones that are not okay.
Correct.
And is there a definition of downcast? Because if there's not, I think it's going to be considered subjective.
In fairness, we did not get into defining these terms, so that is definitely a valid point. I think the idea here is we wanted to present something with respect to exterior lighting that provides a limitation, allows for exploration and discussion, maybe something that if you're all interested in could be more perfected and clarified. And we can look into it more if there are suggestions on that. But as you've stated, rightfully so, it doesn't have a great deal of objectivity, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I respect the idea. I think it gives comfort to neighbors. And I think it was Commissioner Farrick who alluded to the fact that we don't want ADUs to get a bad rap over the course of the next next few years as people like, oh, an ADU went in next door. Like we don't, there's a little bit of sort of branding. We want to do positive karma. We want to keep for them, positive reputation. Talked about the square footage. And then the final thing, in one of your slides, but not in the staff report, windowsill heights were mentioned. While I appreciate that that's something we have discussed in ADU contexts or in small setback contexts in this planning commission, I couldn't think of any way you could make that not subjective. We typically, when we talk about it, we're talking about sill heights, plays in on, or at least how seriously we talk about it is, plays in on how close the other structures are, what kind of concerns neighbors have expressed, how tall the windows are, what kind of room they're in, are they in a bathroom or a stair landing? And like, there's so many variables. I think it's not impossible, but I can imagine it being difficult to make an objective standard. But that's it.
I want to thank Commissioner Schindler for her completeness and thoroughness as always. Commissioner Sillen.
Thank you. Okay, so regarding restrictions, I just had a thought as Commissioner Schindler was speaking. My understanding is some of the restrictions, for example, like having stair landings used as balconies, I could see that being a concern if you are with like right on those 4-foot setbacks, against the rear of the property, whereas the main house has a much bigger setback. So potentially, we could consider something like certain things are not allowed if they're outside of sort of where the primary residence could go, if that makes sense. So if it's within a setback that the primary residence is subject to, then it seems like you should be able to do whatever lighting you want or whatever landing you want. But if it's within like an ADU only setback, maybe there we get a little more restrictive. But that's just an idea. This is not something super important. As far as branding, I think I could see there being some sort of backlash, and we've certainly had some neighbors here upset about ADUs going in. But at the end of the day, what we risk is that we try something, and then if there is a backlash, then I suppose it would be up to City Council to roll back some of the things we've put in place. Then we'd just be right back to where we are now. So I think I'd be open to trying some new things, like Vice Chair Silverstein said, taking this seriously, taking our goals and commitments seriously. So from that perspective, I kind of just brainstormed some ideas. And I kind of tend to look at Portland just because I remember speaking to a developer there a couple of years ago, and they had a lot of interesting programs that should try to incentivize more units on single family lots specifically. And I think what generally we should try to incentivize what we want by tying it to the main residence is how I think they seem to look at it and how we could consider looking at it. So for example, we could consider adding a restriction to the main house. Well, right now, essentially the main house is subject to certain maximums, like building coverage, lot coverage, etc. Let's say if you build one ADU, right now you get the 800 square feet and you get the main house. Maybe if you build two ADUs, you could get an additional 400 square feet for the ADUs and an additional 400 square feet for the main house. So it's like both, it's kind of like a win-win to incentivize the owners so they could get a bigger main house, but only if they build a second ADU. And in order to incentivize the second ADU, they get a little bit more square footage for the ADU. You could do just the second part and not the first. So, hey, if you build one ADU, you get 800 square feet. If you build two, you get, 1,200 or 1,600. You don't get anything extra for the main house. That's another option. And I know that kind of raises the potential concern of like, okay, what are people going to do with these ADUs? So again, with San Diego and Portland, what they've done, I believe in some cases is, maybe for that second ADU, it needs to be a affordable unit. I struggle with that just because given our construction costs here, anytime I've tried to do this math, the rent you'd have to charge on even having that break even would be quite high. But maybe a staff could explore whether there's opportunity. I know that there's affordable housing developers or maybe financing programs that could help out with that. I have no idea, but if that would basically preclude the thing from being built, then we shouldn't do that. So the fallback would be, is there any way we could somehow ensure that it's at least rented out? That could be something to consider. But again, I don't think that's needs to be required. Presumably, if an owner is going to build two ADUs, at least one of them they'd be looking to rent. We could go up to 3 or 4. It would just be a matter of size and location. But those are just some ideas, kind of thinking outside the box a little bit on how we could even further incentivize adding ADUs beyond height and square footage. I think we'd want to look at number of units or potentially number of bedrooms as another option that would get you some sort of incentive, whether that be square footage for the main home, square footage for the ADUs, or both. And just, I would leave that to staff to come back with some potential ideas.
Well, Commissioner Bruzzi's thinking just on the point of ADU law versus SB 9 and what's doing what. I would suggest we do both. Seems good to have multiple pathways if that's what we're trying to do. And so I'm less concerned with the academic distinction of the intent of various laws, and in fact would be happy for there to be somewhat redundant pathways. In practice, I think we see many more people building ADUs than doing lot splits, and so if it had to be in one versus the other, I'd rather have it in ADU law because that seems to be practically more used. But I don't think we should be not doing something via ADU law because we think we're going to do it via SB 9. That seems counterproductive.
Sorry,
Commissioner
real quick.
Sutton.
I just want to add on, just in case staff is doing a tally or anything, I do also support not having parking requirements. I agree with what Commissioner Bersey said. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't park on the street, so it's not going to cause any situation, I think, a detriment to neighbors, which I believe is where this typically comes from. And I do support exploring the idea of being able to sell ADUs separately. I think that would be a very interesting thing to consider.
Commissioner Bersey.
Whoops. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask staff, I know we had discussed during the housing element update the idea of a rental registry. I can't remember where we landed with it. I don't think I know we're not doing it now. But I am really curious about whether any of our ADUs are currently being rented. I'm also curious more generally about our rental housing stock. And I think it's always a little tough. Sorry, that noise is slightly distracting.
Maybe, can we check if the mic at the podium is on?
It's okay. I'll carry on. I think it can be hard to be good at developing effective policy when we don't know what we're looking at to begin with. So it would be interesting to me if it's not at some point down the road, I'm just throwing this out there, to know how our housing stock is being rented, how much, what our occupancy rates are, what our rental rates are, and be able to use that as a basis for forming better recommendations in the future. And I get that there are some logistical complications, but I think Palo Alto is working on this right now. So, there's at least one neighboring city is doing this.
Vice Chair Silverstein. I want to touch on what Commissioner Sillen mentioned around incremental ADUs beyond just one. And it kind of alludes back to the previous thing I said around, should an accessory dwelling unit be accessory in nature? Or should we more consider ADU to be an additional dwelling unit? And I don't know the answer to that. I think certainly reading the staff report and the minimum of state law implies that the general expectation is that we would have, up to one detached ADU on a single family lot. And that is the basic minimum that we could do that may or may not improve the housing situation in Menlo Park. But I guess this is a question for staff. Given the kind of creativity that Commissioner Sillen mentioned and what other municipalities seem to be doing in regards to incentivizing multiple ADUs for true increased density, is that a direction that, I don't want to betray any conversations, but is that a direction that this project could end up going? And is that something that there had been either any direction? I want to know if that is an avenue that the commission is worth exploring from the commission that wouldn't necessarily be dead in the water. And I don't want to waste anyone's time, but I do at least appreciate the creativity and what it could potentially unlock in terms of the housing stock. And I don't even know if you can answer that question, so I posed it, but feel free to decline if it's unanswerable.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. This evening, staff's taking feedback, as mentioned previously. A lot of these comments, questions, input, we will receive them, evaluate them. That the commission certainly can discuss, additional items beyond what is in the draft ordinance this evening. The draft ordinance was intended to help focus the conversation, but certain topics can definitely be brought up and discussed. We're taking feedback, we're taking notes. We're not really in a position this evening to opine on whether something could be supported or not. We will need to do that evaluation. post the meeting and bring it back as part of an ordinance.
Yeah, no, it stopped. I have one last question, which is why do we care about the percentage of a covered porch relative to the square footage of the ADU? And is that something that I know it was in here? I know it's not state mandated, and I know that no one seems to be opposed to it, but I just while reading it, I don't know why I personally should care. I mean, maybe someone can make the pitch why I should care whether or not someone has a large, medium, or small covered porch relative to the size of their ADU.
Commissioner Baruzzi.
I would hazard a guess. Are we talking about pool houses or something? I'm curious from staff. What's the extra large covered porch signifying?
The main concern here is just the fact that a covered porch could be used in a, it could be something that is attached to an ADU, but I think this could be something that could be taken advantage of, and it could be expanded beyond kind of a reasonable amount. I think anecdotally, there are just instances where the covered porch is, a little more ambiguous in its relation to the primary residence, and it could be the case that a development has a larger covered porch and takes advantage of that to benefit the site as a whole and maybe not the ADU directly.
So just to be clear, you're saying like they wouldn't have been permitted, they wouldn't have been allowed to put a big covered porch on the main house, but they would be allowed to put it on the ADU. And we're trying to, so that's the scenario where we're basically saying if it's associated with an ADU, it's a loophole for them getting something bigger than they would have gotten otherwise. Or something else.
Maybe I can try. So a covered porch attached to a main dwelling needs to meet the setback requirements per se, or other development regulations of that main dwelling unit. A detached open air structure would be an accessory structure and would have its own regulations that are not necessarily the same as an ADU. And so what we're trying to solve for is a proportional covered porch entryway to the size of the unit versus one that could be, the same size of the unit, and then you end up with a substantially large structure, potentially very close to a neighbor, potentially creating some potential impacts to that neighbor. So it's really, and then from staff's perspective, trying to solve for, some scenarios we have seen with some large covered porches that aren't typical of what would be an entryway to a main unit or to an ADU in this case, but would really be, functioning more like a extension of, let's say, the main dwelling's overall landscaping area, if that makes sense, and structures on the project site.
Are covered porches subject to setback requirements?
They are. Mm-hmm.
So the only way you could have a large covered porch close to your neighbor is if the initial ADU or structure was even further set back from the minimum requirement. Is that correct?
Yes, potentially. I think there's a couple nuances here regarding state regulations versus local regulations for accessory structures and buildings versus ADUs, what state requires staff to permit by right versus where the city might have some discretion. And once again, there's hypotheticals here that really would be difficult to get into. What staff was trying to solve for was a recommendation about proportionality. That was it, basically.
And sorry, you might have, I know you mentioned something about primary residence covered porches, but do we have that same proportionality requirement on a primary residence that you wanted to build?
No.
And so in theory, I could have a small house and a massive covered porch, although maybe that doesn't happen as often as it.
You would be regulated by building coverage, which would preclude you from doing exactly the hypothetical you talked about.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my last question regarding the covered porch requirements is, I appreciate that staff wanted to limit it to proportionality, and I'm wondering whether or not it would make more sense to just limit the objective size of the covered porch, regardless of if you have a small or large ADU, because thinking about the benefit of an entryway doesn't necessarily scale in, I mean, maybe aesthetically it certainly does, but in terms of the practicality or the utility of a entryway or covered porch doesn't, in my mind, scale with the size of the structure, but rather, if you want to keep a stroller there, or you want to have a shoe shelf, that to me is more of an objective standard as opposed to a relative one.
So can you give an example of a time when you've seen this covered porch scenario, like an accessory structure masquerading as an ADU? Has that happened pretty recently? I feel like we're talking about something specific.
There's been I mean, we certainly have seen this on a number of permits where, as part of an overall development plan, there's a primary residence, there's an ADU, there is a large attached covered porch accessory structure. It may be in relation to a pool on site or some outdoor living. And so it starts to potentially be designed as not independent living. So
Yes.
once again, staff's recommendation was for a proportional sized covered porch that would really, relate to the ADU, create that independent living. We don't have specific examples this evening, but certainly the idea is we have seen some examples or some developments like this. And so this was a recommendation from staff. It is simply a recommendation this evening. So
Yeah.
we're taking feedback like we mentioned. We'll evaluate the feedback. But the goal, as I've mentioned previously, is really to create a proportionally sized covered entry to an ADU.
I mean, maybe there's something that you could do if you're thinking about the intent as opposed to the, would be something around preserving independence through landscaping or facing or something along those lines. I could imagine, especially after the pandemic, when we started socializing outdoors more, I could imagine people being grateful for a covered outdoor space that was attached to their ADU that would be useful to them, beyond just like, a little extra eave. But maybe there's a way to explore other kinds of separation from the main house entertainment zone or something like that. I'm not articulating that well, but if what we're talking about is covered outdoor kitchens and pool houses, like I would agree, that doesn't seem to, like, getting to put those within 4 feet of your neighbor's house doesn't seem like a great use of the ADU laws. But I wouldn't want to ban covered porches.
If I may, I don't want to go down too many hypotheticals here, but 20% on 1,000 square feet is 200 square feet.
Yeah, that's great.
Right? So we're not talking about a small square footage here. 20% of a 500 square foot ADU would be 100 square feet. So 800 is going to be somewhere between those two, right? So you are talking about a pretty large porch even at 20%. That's where staff came from with that. It was thoughtful. It was evaluated. We did crunch some numbers. That felt like a reasonable amount.
That seems fair.
Okay. I am seeing no other requests to speak. I think we have coalesced around some themes that staff can look at. And I at least look forward to the next round of this. If not seeing any other commission updates, I think I'm going to call this study session to a close and move us on from item F1. Thank you all, and thank you to staff for all of the work that went into this, which was obviously quite a great deal. That brings us to informational items. Mr. Parada, would staff like to share details on any upcoming planning commission meetings?
Yes, thank you. So this is the last meeting for 2025. So Our next meeting will be in January of 2026. It will be January 12th. That agenda, or that, excuse me, that notice will go out this week, given the holidays. And so don't have an official list of items, but we do have, I believe at this point, in the tentative scheduled 2 single-family homes and an architectural control on a multifamily residential building. Further out, potentially we have a 50-unit housing development project later in January, but that's tentative. So that's kind of an update on upcoming meetings, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Prada. Are there any questions from commissioners or additional informational items? Okay, then I will wish everyone a very happy holidays and adjourn this meeting at 10:30 p.m.